And if, in case we don't have time for questions, you can also feel free to shoot me an email, and I'll do my best to answer any queries. So my talk is actually going to be much more general in a way. I'm going to be talking more about the influence of stress and adversity in our lives and in the lives of our offspring. I'm going to be drawing on biological systems, evolutionary theory to illustrate my points. And to begin, I have a quote from Stendhal from The Red and the Black. And he stated the first law of every creature is self-preservation, to keep alive. So why is this important? Well, life is dangerous. We are biological creatures. Humans have been around for about 6 million years. Homo sapiens evolved around 300,000 years ago from Homo erectus. And human civilization as we know it really started forming around 6,000 years ago. So we're still pretty recent on this evolutionary scale game. And not only are we biological creatures, we are frail biological creatures. So fossil evidence reveals that about 99.9% of all species thought to ever have existed are actually now extinct. And most of this is not due to mass extinction events, as we might think. So given this backdrop, it's actually pretty impressive that we're still around. So species survival in a dangerous world is really part of our wiring. And it's even been argued that there is an evolutionary basis to being paranoid. And in case anybody wants some interesting reading on that, I've added a reference there. So just how dangerous is life? Well, Mr. Frank Duckworth, who is a retired English statistician, he actually developed a scale called Duckworth Scale, which is a logarithmic scale from 0 to 8. It's sort of like a Richter scale for earthquakes. And it sort of quantifies the risk of how dangerous certain activities are to our life. And he goes all the way from 0, something which would be kind of as supposedly benign as just being alive on Earth for a year, all the way to 8, which would be something which would pretty much inevitably be fatal, like jumping off the Eiffel Tower or jumping in front of a Flying Scotsman train. And along the way, he would kind of quantify other things, such as getting in a plane and flying for 100 miles, which he gave a 1.7 to, and maintaining rock climbing as a hobby for 20 years, which he gave a 6.3. If you do it like free solo, that risk might be a bit higher, honestly. And there are, ways of even predicting, when we're going to perish. So there are things online, there are death clocks actually, that you can plug in your data into, and they'll ask you things like your date of birth, your BMI, lifestyle habits like smoking and drinking. They'll ask what your outlook is. Are you, kind of pessimistic, optimistic, neutral? And then they'll actually give you a readout. So I put my data in there, and according to this website anyway, I'll be shuffling off this mortal coil in about 36 years or so. So whether that's true or not, I'll leave that up to faith, honestly. But the question is there any validity to this idea that we can kind of put together markers that can predict when we're going to die? And researchers have looked into whether certain composite biomarker panels can predict time to death. And there have been several that are independently associated with all-cause mortality. In a study by Joris Dielan, over 44,000 people were actually profiled, drawing from 12 different cohorts, and a combination of 14 markers that are involved with lipid level regulation, inflammation, glycemic control, even controlling for things like sex, age, and cause of death were showed in combination to predict the risk of death in 5 to 10 years. So there is something to this idea that circumscribing certain markers can predict longevity. And importantly, our body is very wise, and it's better attuned to its current state than we could ever be on a conscious level. So the body's tissue ecology actually emphasizes survival and reproduction. So because of this, critical organs actually have more anti-cancer mechanisms. If an organ is vital and it's unpaired, such as the heart or the brain, it's going to have more biological self-preservation mechanisms in place. We don't really ever hear about heart cancer. It's a thing, but it's exceedingly rare. If you have a tumor in the brain, it's 10 times more likely to have originated from somewhere else and to actually be metastatic. These are organs we simply can't do without. And even unpaired organs that are involved in reproduction, such as the uterus and the prostate, they certainly have cancerous growth, but they also have been shown to have more of these anti-cancer mechanisms in place. And even with prostate cancer, it's usually a type that happens later in life and it's slow growing, so it's not likely to impact reproductive fitness when it does happen. So because of this the body's emphasis on these two aspects, there may be trade-offs which take place to maximize these outcomes, even if this happens in detriment to what we consider holistic wellness. There's a very interesting phenomenon that happens in genetics, which is called antagonistic pleiotropy. It's a mouthful, but what it means in simpler terms is that a single gene can promote different effects. Some of these effects will be adaptive in some ways, and some effects will be maladaptive in other ways. And the reason this happens is that it may be for the goodness of reproductive fitness, even if there are longer term costs. So if we look at the graph down here, and if we look at this gene A, for instance, and if we look over here on the y-axis in terms of Darwinian fitness, in one particular situation or environment, this allele A is increasing fitness. But if we think about it from a different aspect or in a different type of environment, it may actually be decreasing fitness. So it's the same gene that in some ways is causing you to be more fit, and in other ways is causing you to be less fit. So thinking about this more practically, people will often question, why is schizophrenia still around, for instance? Why haven't evolutionary pressures eliminated this illness? And the same thing with some neurologic and neurodegenerative illnesses. And one possible explanation for this is reproductive fitness, actually. So with Huntington's disease, for instance, which is a genetic neurologic disease, the people who have this disease have been shown to have higher fecundity. And in schizophrenia, for instance, some of the associated alleles with schizophrenia can actually promote increased fertility in unaffected relatives. So if we go back to that same graph from before, and if we think, for instance, with schizophrenia, if we think about this allele A predisposing to schizophrenia, in the sense of neuropsychiatric health, because it can cause a very severe illness, it's decreasing fitness. But because those same alleles can lead to an increase in reproductive success, it's actually increasing fitness. And that's one evolutionary reason why some of these conditions may have survived, because it may be kind of a biological mechanism to try to enhance species survival, even if it doesn't make much sense to us. So this is not only an evolutionary consideration across longer timelines, but adaptations also take place within one's lifetime. So adapting to environmental pressures may include shifting physiological systems and behaviors. So these shifts are going to be accompanied by changes in neural circuitry, endocrine response, and epigenetic markers. And these markers may be passed down to future generations, preparing them for similar environments. So the thread to keep in mind is that as maladaptive as some of these changes that I'm going to be talking about may seem, they may exist in the service of keeping oneself alive and preparing offspring to stay alive too. So there's a biological imperative which is at play, which goes beyond one's mental well-being. So here I'm going to transition to talking about the impact of stress within and across generations. So I'm going to talk first about stress within one's lifetime, so within generation, the stress that I undergo and what impact that has on me. And then the next part I'll talk about the intergenerational aspect. I've preferred the term intergenerational because it's much broader. Intergenerational denotes transmission that happens across one or more generations. The term transgenerational was kind of thrown around a lot, but it's actually a very specific term, and I don't have time to go into it, but it refers more to the impact which happens in generations which are much more removed from the original stressor. So starting with within generation impact of stress. So these are the three dimensions that I'm going to be covering in this talk: the epigenetic part, neural circuitry, and behavior. And starting with epigenetics. So to give a very brief definition of what epigenetics is, these are long-term DNA modifications that don't affect the sequence, but they can actually modulate gene regulation and expression. So we see here that we have this little epigenetic mark just coming in, sitting right there on top of that little nucleotide there. So you're not actually changing the sequence, but you're adding something to the DNA structure, and that's going to influence how this gene gets expressed or not. So Why does this happen? It's evolved to allow organisms to adapt to extreme environmental conditions. So phenotypes, which is what you see, have been shaped to be acutely advantageous to the individual. So stressed organisms could return to a basal state once these conditions improved, because all you really did to adapt to the environment was add that little group onto the DNA. You didn't change the sequence. So the idea was things get better, that group could be removed. Part of the issue is sometimes there was no improvement in environmental conditions. So those markers could actually be retained and they could be transmitted down to their progeny, to their offspring. And the most extensively described epigenetic change in psychiatric research is DNA methylation. And the methyl group is circled down there, it's the CH3, and it's basically the addition of this methyl group to a cytosine residue. Pretty straightforward. So what does methylation do? Well, if we look down at this picture here, these little white circles here, this represents unmethylated chromatin. This is the DNA structure, right? Chromatin. So you can see that this here is much more relaxed. It's much more open. If I add methyl groups, these little red dots here, it actually tightens the structure up. You can see it's much more coiled. So what this does spatially is block the binding of transcription proteins. So this DNA is going to be much harder to read because physically it's harder for those proteins to actually reach the sites they need to reach for the gene to be transcribed. So that means that the gene doesn't get read, basically. So methylation, in short, leads to gene silencing. Now, methylation can actually increase as we age. So one thing that's been kind of trending a little bit are epigenetic clocks. And what these are readouts of age-associated methylation patterns from loci across the genome. And amazingly, these clocks can actually predict our chronological age with high accuracy. So one example is the Horvath. It's one of the first ones. In humans, they looked at the methylation status of 353 cytosines across the human genome, and they show that it can predict chronological age of an individual with an error of 3.6 years, which is pretty impressive. And some animal species, it's actually with an error of weeks. So we can see here, this is the epigenetic age here, kind of the sum of the methylation markers. There's pretty close alignment between chronological age and epigenetic age. So the term accelerated epigenetic aging denotes that when there's excessive methylation relative to an individual's chronological age. So basically my epigenetic markers are suggesting that I'm older than the number of years I've been alive. So why can this happen? Well, methylation is not only a marker of aging, it's also a marker of organismic stress, how much stress I go through in my life. So if I undergo accelerated epigenetic aging, my body's going to feel older in a way. So that might influence how I allocate my resources biologically. And going back to what I was saying at the beginning, they may be allocated to prioritize survival in a way. So accelerated epigenetic aging can influence the timing of life events, including maturation of endocrine and neural systems, reproductive senescence, and even disease risk. And what's been shown is that if I have accelerated epigenetic aging, this is associated with an increased risk of cancer, cardiovascular disease, Parkinson's disease, and neurocognitive diseases. So if we look at this graph right here, looking here at the healthy control, the yellow dots, we see that there's a pretty there's a pretty close alignment here between chronological age and the person's epigenetic age. This is also the Horvath clock. If we look at this, the population that has bladder cancer, for instance, we can see, for instance, this individual, their chronological age is about 60 or so, but their epigenetic age is about 80. So they're much aged from an epigenetic standpoint, potentially as a result or predisposing them to this illness. So we talked about what accelerated aging can predispose us to, but what is that can get us there in the first place? And this is not a comprehensive list, but some examples of what can cause acceleration in epigenetic aging are things like diet, living conditions, including poor sanitation, limited water access, decreased living space, lower levels of education, substance use, which is germane to today's talk, and importantly, lifetime stress and cortisol levels. And this is very well substantiated. But also, interestingly, some professions can do it. So people who do shift work for over 10 years were actually shown to have an epigenetic age that's 3 years older than people who never did shift work. And this effect is particularly strong for those who do night shift work. I'm sure people will have reactions to that. Tobacco exposure, smoking, can lead to global methylation changes. And interestingly, there's another type of epigenetic clock which was developed, which is called the Grim age DNA methylation. And it sounds grim because it is. It actually predicts time to death based on methylation status. And it's uniquely impacted by smoking. And what's been shown is that even if physical activity can decrease some of the epigenetic aging, which some studies have shown, smoking can actually counter that. So if you exercise and smoke, the two may be canceling each other out. And if we remember that death clock from earlier, it was a very binary thing in terms of smoking being kind of a risk factor that may impact longevity. And to further this point, if we go back to the Duckworth scale, Mr. Duckworth had put a 35-year-old man who smokes 20 cigarettes a day, how risky is this to life? He put it up there at a 6.9, which is just a few decimal points lower than a game of Russian roulette. So we sometimes tend to normalize smoking, really, but it's actually very pernicious and very damaging on epigenetic age and overall health markers. So I'm going to be moving on to neural circuitry. And one concept that I want to outline first is what's called the sensitive period of neural development. This is a narrow window during which the environment is going to have its greatest and most enduring impact. So this happens during early childhood. Neuroplasticity allows for encoding of these environmental effects. What does plasticity mean? I'm defining this as the active capacity of the brain to modify neural networks through growth and reorganization. Now, the sensitive period in animals correlates with average life expectancy. So in humans, it's going to be roughly the first 7 years of life. And this is when the environment's going to have its strongest impact. So as the sensitive period starts to close and become more stabilized, these neural networks that are shaped by experience, they're actually going to kind of get locked in a way. They're actually mechanical factors that can kind of impede continued growth. So if we look over here on the right, we can see this little green structure. That's actually called a perineuronal net. It kind of wraps around parts of the neuron to keep it from continuing to grow. And myelination is also an example of some of these brake-like factors that keep things from being rewired too much. We can't just have a brain that's endlessly plastic because it's actually quite exposing and it's not evolutionarily sound. So as these circuits kind of get stabilized, we draw maps and we lock them in of what our cognitive and emotional experience of the environment is. These are established early and very efficiently. It's actually biologically very wasteful to try to reorganize these maps. That's why they happen very early in life. So if I'm in an enriched, safe environment growing up, that sensitive period is actually going to be a bit longer, and my plasticity is going to be greater as well. So the child who's in this type of environment of felt safety, they're able to sample, learn about their surroundings through play and through exploration. And one important structure in navigating our response to the environment is the amygdala. So the amygdala is sensitive to signs of threat in the environment. And through its connection with the hypothalamus, it helps modulate stress hormone release through the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So what does that look like pictorially? So the stressful stimulus comes in, the amygdala is activated. There's that connectivity with the hypothalamus that I was mentioning. And the cascade down through the HPA axis is going to lead to cortisol release. Cortisol is kind of our let's deal with stress hormone. So there's a sense that we kind of need to be attentive, alert, and dealing with a potential threat in the environment. So, but this shouldn't be excessive. So cortisol is released, and then it's going to, through a negative feedback loop, go back to the brain and bind to these glucocorticoid receptors in order to terminate the stress response. You know, kind of the signal is we've released enough cortisol, cut it out, and I have these receptors there that are going to help stop that cascade from continuing. So if we zoom in on a cellular level to this interaction here between cortisol and the glucocorticoid receptor, so the glucocorticoid receptor gene is down there inside the cell, producing the receptor. Cortisol is a small lipophilic molecule, so it easily passes through the plasma membrane, and it's going to bind to the glucocorticoid receptor, and by doing that, that negative feedback loop is going to be completed, and we're going to stop our cortisol release and terminate that stress response. This is what should be physiologically happening. Okay. One other important protein for promoting brain growth and plasticity is called BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And it's involved in the maturation of cortical areas that can actually dampen too much of an emotional response. So examples of these areas are areas of the prefrontal cortex, which you can see over there, and the hippocampus. Both of those, if they develop appropriately, will have this negative input into the amygdala, which basically controls amygdala reactivity so that we're not reacting too strongly to sensed threat, because the alternative would be that we're going to have much more of an emotion-based reaction to the environment. So we need these higher cortical areas, more evolved cortical areas, to control our emotions to some extent. Part of the problem that can happen is if we don't grow up in that safe environment that I was mentioning earlier, and if we're raised in an overly stressful environment, what this can lead to is an excessive activation of the amygdala and an excessive activation of that HPA axis. Too much cortisol gets released. And this is compounded by methylation of that BDNF gene and of the glucocorticoid receptor gene. I mentioned you methylate something, it does not get expressed. So looking at this picture again, if we methylate that BDNF gene and decrease its expression, there's going to be an impaired development in those areas which modulate the amygdala reactivity. So that doesn't happen. This means that the amygdala is going to be overly active with nothing to counter it. And the sense of threat may be greater, and our reactions to the environment are going to be more impulsive and emotion-based. And what's been shown is that in early abuse, that the individual will actually have smaller hippocampi and impairment in development of the medial prefrontal cortex. If we zoom in to that earlier image of what's happening in the cell, if I methylate the glucocorticoid receptor gene, as I mentioned, you methylate something, you don't express it. If I don't express it, that's not going to happen. So we're going to have a bunch of cortisol circulating around with nothing to stop the stress response. So we need that glucocorticoid receptor to ensure that feedback loop gets completed. If I don't have the receptor, I can't give the negative feedback. So I'm just going to have a sustained increase in circulating cortisol, and I'm going to maintain my stress response because I have nothing to terminate it. And both glucocorticoid receptor and BDNF methylation have been associated with later psychopathology and with completed suicides. What's been shown is that early adversity will lead to a shortening of that sensitive period that I was mentioning before. There's going to be less plasticity because there's going to be lower levels of BDNF circulating. And basically, we have a lot of cortisol circulating. We have a lot of other excitotoxic neurotransmitters such as glutamate circulating around. So like I was mentioning, if the brain is exposed to kind of these stress hormones, it's actually very dangerous. So the brain tries to protect itself from further insults. So those brakes that I was mentioning earlier, they come on a lot sooner than they should to protect the brain, basically. Those nets that I was mentioning in the myelination, they come on earlier, so your brain actually develops prematurely as a way of protecting itself from more stress. But what gets locked in is a stress-based map of the environment, one that's kind of informed by much more of an emotional reaction to threat as opposed to something that I can actually think through. And the problem is this gets locked in, and it's actually very difficult to modify through future positive experiences. And one example of this is the English and Romanian Adoptee project, which studied the effects on children suffering extended and severe deprivation in Romanian orphanages during the Ceausescu regime. So these children were separated from their biological parents at birth, and they were kept in orphanages for 16 to 60 months. very little attention being paid to them. And it was shown that they had subsequent volume decreases in total brain, in gray matter, and in white matter. And importantly, these changes in brain volume lasted into adulthood, even if they were placed in nurturing environments for the remainder of their childhood. There was a very short window within the first 6 months or so that if they were adopted then, that these effects could be salvaged. But otherwise, the effects were, were pretty consistent. They were permanent. And we can see here that there's actually a linear correlation between the impact on total brain volume and the number of months during which they underwent deprivation. So linear increase. The more deprivation, the smaller the brain volume. So to recap some of these points that I've been making, early adversity can lead to an underdevelopment of areas involved with cognitive strategies and behavioral control, those areas, the PFC, the prefrontal cortex, and the hippocampus, and a premature and excessive development of areas that are involved with immediate emotion-based responses. What about behavior? How does stress impact behavior? Well, we know that childhood abuse can lead to long-lasting behavioral effects. Early models of the environment are difficult to replace with later ones. And again, we can make that link with the neurobiological map that gets traced, how that gets locked in and carried forward into later life. What gets modeled to us from our early environment a lot of times is what we take with us into adulthood, and it can be very difficult to change that. So this may predispose us to repetition of traumatic early templates. So Kathy Whittam described what's called the cycle of maltreatment, in which there's a repetition of victimization experiences. In effect, if we're abused early on, we may put ourselves in situations where we're going to be abused again, or situations in which we actually abuse other people. So abuse can lead to repetition of violence, as well as impulsive and hypersexual behaviors. In men and women, early adversity can lead to subsequent sexual coercion, dating violence, and risky sexual practices. So what's the evolutionary tie-in? Or in other words, what might be leading to some of these behavioral changes? Well, one of the other consequences of abuse is that we have premature epigenetic aging. So the timing of physiological events, as I was mentioning, may be accelerated, and there might need to be a reallocation of biological resources. And one thing that's been shown is that exposure to cues indicating elevated mortality rates in one's environment is one of the strongest prompts to accelerate reproductive strategies. And these pressures are not unique to humans. So, for instance, when survival is felt to be threatened, reproduction may be emphasized. So some plants don't flower unless they're stressed. So there's such a thing as stress-induced flowering. Stick plants in a lower temperature. For instance, we can see the plant in C over here that the floral buds are actually much more prominent. This plant was in the cold for 40 days compared to plant A, which was in the cold for 0 days. You want to get a plant to flower, stick it in the fridge. And this also happens in other animal species. So the chronological age at which reproductive maturity occurs will depend on the epigenetic age. So we can see, for instance, this frog here in blue, the chronological age at which the epigenetic age over here on the y-axis and the chronological age here. This is where reproductive maturity is reached. So the two of them are kind of aligning, it looks like. But if there's undue stress or disease, the animal may reach that same epigenetic age at a much younger chronological age. And this accelerated epigenetic aging creates pressures to speed up other biological systems, in this case leading to an earlier reproductive maturity. In humans, in borderline personality disorder, the life expectancy is actually decreased by up to 27.5 years. You may think it's because of suicide, but actually that's a very small proportion that's due to suicide. These patients are at a much higher risk of a number of medical comorbidities, which may shorten lifespan. And we know that borderline personality disorder, a very high percentage suffered childhood sexual abuse. A quarter up to half can show promiscuity or precipitousness upon entering sexual relationships. Sexual abuse is considerably higher in women compared to men. It can exceed 3 to 1. So I'm going to be focusing more on the impact of abuse on women regarding physiological systems. So early stress in women is associated with an earlier age of menarche, with earlier pregnancies, increased sexual risk-taking in adolescence. So why does menarche happen earlier? Well, the body is physiologically, epigenetically already older. So the timing of these physiological events is going to be accelerated. So if we look at the x-axis down here, the age of menarche, in those who have a slower epigenetic aging, more paced, and aren't under undue stress, they have later menarches. But those who have faster epigenetic aging, they have earlier menarches. So there is a direct correlation. So is there a correlation between having an earlier menarche and actually having a higher chance of conception? The short answer is yes. So those who have looked at when 50% of cycles are going to be ovulatory have shown if menarche happens at the age of 13 or older, it takes 4.5 years. This would be in line with a more paced reproductive development. But if menarche happens earlier, it's accelerated. If it happens under the age of 12, for instance, it only takes 1 year. So the body is able to conceive earlier. There's an increase in impulsive sexual behaviors. This makes reproduction more likely. So these may be the biological shock waves of early trauma that are driving this. And Quintina Felder from University of Helsinki, she studied war-exposed populations. She showed that there is a reproductive acceleration in this group. She showed that girls aged 4 to 11 years were separated from their parents during World War II actually had earlier menarches and more children by adulthood. And this has been replicated in some other studies, also surrounding stressors during wartime. Belsky and Shalev kind of summarized the effects of stress and the programming that happens. They stated, if contextual cues such as poverty, harsh parenting, and household chaos indicate that the environment is harsh and unpredictable, and thus infers that the future will be as well, then programming should accelerate development by lowering the age of sexual maturity and thereby increase the chance of breeding before dying, and thus passing on one's genes. And here I'm going to move on to the next part of the talk, which is the intergenerational impact of stress. So there is much that's been presented in the popular media about the legacy of trauma being carried in DNA, but scientific inquiry has not really justified such straightforward conclusions. It really calls more for caution in interpreting data and for further research more than anything. And one of the reasons is that in mammals, there are mechanisms against inter and transgenerational inheritance, including in humans extensive epigenetic reprogramming in germ cells in early embryogenesis. This includes 2 waves of genome-wide demethylation. So if we look down here, we can see development all the way from the primordial germ cells over here through embryogenesis, fetal development, and birth. And this is basically the oscillation in methylation that's present in the child or the developing fetus up until the moment of birth. And what we can see is there are 2 drops in the levels of methylation which take place, pretty much trying to give us a clean slate. Nature tries to do it to some extent. Now, some of these groups are going to get added back depending on the efficiency of this removal process. So why might inheritance of these methyl groups take place? If the parents have too high of a methylation load, it might exceed their ability to repair it. So these epigenetic changes may last through both reprogramming events and get passed down to future generations. And importantly, in human germ cells, several loci which escape those DNA demethylation waves have been associated with neuropsychiatric illness. So I'm going to be talking about 2 different ways in which the child might be impacted. Basically, preconception stressors in the parents, and then the effects of exposure which takes place during pregnancy. So first, this is the effects of parental lifetime stress. So however much stress I go through before conceiving, for instance, before fathering a child, that stress is going to influence how much methylation load is going to be in germ cells, in gametes, rather, in spermatozoa. So, and basically, the same thing for a partner, so those two methylation loads come together, and that's basically what's going to make up the offspring. So it's a pretty big deal. And if we look at the content of methyl groups in spermatozoa and oocytes, the two of them really work together in a way to create those waves of demethylation, to get rid of those groups so that the child is born without very much. And it's really an amazing instance of a physiological ballet, basically, between the two, because spermatozoa actually have the enzyme for the first step of the removal process, but they don't have the enzymes for the rest. Oocytes, they don't have that first enzyme, but they have the other ones. So the two really have to work together and collaborate to get rid of those methylation, of the methylation load for the child. So if the process is effective, the child's born with a pretty low methylation level. But what is it that can happen that leads to this other scenario, where the child's going to be born with a high methylation burden? So, as I was mentioning before, if the parents have a methylation load which is too much and it exceeds their reparative capacities, this may lead to the child being born with a high methylation load. So in parents, poor diets, not exercising, substance use, advanced age, and trauma history, all of these can lead to an excess of methyl markers in the gametes, and that can get passed down to children. So a woman who's very stressed, for instance, throughout life, when she becomes pregnant, she may actually have a uterine environment that's influenced by the impact of this stress. And this is going to affect how fetal development unfolds. So for instance, in a woman who has a childhood abuse history, when she becomes pregnant, she's going to have elevation in circulating cortisol levels. It's one of our stress hormones. And she may have an increased inflammatory markers in utero as well. So how does this impact offspring? Well, it can actually increase odds of preterm delivery, and it can increase expression of the enzyme that actually puts the methyl group on DNA in the fetus. So this might increase their methylation level at birth because the uterine environment was kind of in more of a pro-inflammatory state because of the lifetime stress that the mother went through prior to becoming pregnant. In female Holocaust survivors with PTSD, when they have children, what's been shown in their offspring is that the latter has impaired cortisol reactivity, and they may have higher rates of mood disorders, anxiety disorders, and PTSD themselves. They may be primed because of the mother's history to react in particular ways to stressors. And what's been shown, for instance, in Yom Kippur war veterans, is that they were more likely to develop PTSD in response to combat if they had a Holocaust survivor parent. And what about stress that takes place between conception and birth? So if the woman is very stressed during her pregnancy, what effect can this have? Well, the long and the short is, if a mother is experiencing stress during her pregnancy, this can elevate stress hormone levels in the child. And this can happen through two different processes: gene methylation in the placenta and gene methylation in the fetus themselves. So we'll start with the placental gene methylation. So the fetus will have an HPA axis too. They'll have kind of a stress system as well. And it's active by around 22 weeks of gestation. So from that point on, they're actually going to be much more sensitive to the influence of how stressed the mother is and to her own cortisol levels. Now, ordinarily, the placenta actually produces an enzyme that deactivates cortisol. It's called 11-beta-hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase. And it converts cortisol into an inactive compound called cortisone. So this stops the child from being exposed to too much circulating cortisol. So in a study done by Catherine Monk, she assessed 61 women who were pregnant, and they were between 24 and 27 gestational weeks. They were assessed for mood symptoms and salivary cortisol. And what they noted was if the mother was stressed at that point in the pregnancy, that was actually associated with methylation of that placental gene. Now, if you remember what I've been kind of mentioning during this talk, you methylate something and you don't express it. If I don't express this enzyme, I don't have any way of inactivating cortisol. So the result is the child, the fetus, will be exposed to higher levels of circulating cortisol, literally feeling the mother's stress level. And changes can also take place in the fetus as well. So placental genes can be methylated, increasing the cortisol levels, and fetal genes can also be methylated, increasing cortisol levels. So if the mother experiences depression during the 3rd trimester, if the mother's exposed to war or rape during pregnancy, or if she's exposed to intimate partner violence during pregnancy, all of this can lead to methylation of the fetal glucocorticoid receptor promoter. And you may remember, if I don't have that glucocorticoid receptor, I have no way of terminating that stress response feedback loop. I mentioned it earlier. If we don't have that receptor, we don't terminate the stress response. We're going to have circulating cortisol and no way of decreasing it, no way of stopping the release. So the child's stress response system is overactive as a result of the mother's stress. So what all these examples have in common is that, again, mother is stressed, child is going to have elevated cortisol levels. So basically the child is going to be born prepared in a way to face a potentially hostile and dangerous world because they're going to have an elevation in their stress hormones, kind of imagining biologically that you're going to encounter the same stressful environment that the intrauterine environment is preparing you for. And for those of you who like mythology, the most salient example of intergenerational trauma transmission is the myth of the birth of Athena. Zeus gets bashed in the head with a hammer, and Athena actually springs forward from his head, fully grown and fully armed. So his trauma leads to her being ready for battle. But there is a third dimension. This kind of confounds the picture even further, and it makes for this whole intergenerational transmission question in humans very complicated to ascertain, and that's the effects of continued stress due to being raised by psychiatrically ill or traumatized parents. So after birth, during early childhood, if your parents are psychiatrically ill or traumatized, that's going to have an impact on you as well. And there's something which is termed secondary traumatization, which has been described in the offspring of traumatized parents. And these children may over-identify with their parents. They may have poor self-esteem and guilt. They may minimize their own life experiences because they're constantly comparing them to the life experiences of their parents. They may catastrophize, may be very anxious and hypervigilant. They may have behavioral disturbances. And very importantly, what's been shown in that is that in non-clinical populations, populations that don't necessarily have a diagnosis, offspring of Holocaust survivals did not show higher rates of psychopathology. So just being the offspring of a Holocaust survivor does not mean that you're at a higher risk of psychiatric illness necessarily. So there might be something to this idea that if you're raised by a Holocaust survivor who actually is symptomatic, that in itself, those continued symptoms of them raising you during your childhood might have a greater impact than anything genetic or intergenerational. And Rachel Yehuda, who's the main researcher in intergenerational transmission in Holocaust survivors, said, in studies of Holocaust offspring, perhaps the most salient observation has been that most differences in offspring phenotype were associated with persistent psychological effects of parents. And another dimension which might confound the picture is the effects of continued stress due to socioeconomic factors, being raised in conditions of poverty, for instance. So social disadvantage has been associated with a limitation in caregivers' ability to provide sensitive care to children, and this may affect offspring's cognitive and linguistic skills. And some researchers have indicated that epigenetic transmission can't be studied in conditions of impoverishment because the environment's going to have such an overwhelming effect on the child's development that you can't adequately study that. It's not all bad. So is there anything that our interventions can do to help address some of these issues? And this is really just a sampling because I don't have time to go into all of this. But is there anything that can be done within generation? If I've had a lifetime of stress and I go into treatment, is there anything that's offered in the mental health field that can help undo some of these effects? Well, yes, to some extent. Being on chronic SSRI treatment has actually been shown to remove some of those neuronal breaks that I was mentioning. Those perineuronal nets can actually be taken off of certain areas of the brain, and that is going to reopen some of those sensitive periods, some of those plastic periods as well. There was a lot of enthusiasm about using valproic acid for neurocognitive disorders about 10 years ago with kind of similar philosophy. Valproic acid acts on histone marker deacetylation, but it didn't really stand up too much, unfortunately. But we do know that some drugs and some interventions we have can promote neurogenesis. Psychotherapy, dialectical behavior therapy in borderline personality disorder for 4 weeks was shown to actually demethylate BDNF. If I demethylate a gene, it'll express more. BDNF is involved with neurogenesis, so psychotherapy can promote neurogenesis. Intergenerationally, in mice models, there is such a thing as positive stress. So if these mice undergo mild to moderate early life stress, that can actually kind of inoculate them in a way and improve resilience. So they may have an improved response to adulthood stress. They may have increased expression in some of those glucocorticoid receptors, which can stop the stress response, increase neural transmission in the hippocampus, and importantly, that improved resilience can get passed down to offspring. So there's an intergenerational effect. Another example of positive stress is exercise, and this is in humans. The 3 months of exercise can actually lead to a change in the DNA methylation profile in sperm. So there's a potential for an intergenerational transmission of a kind of a better gene profile. And several of these genes that were studied in association with exercise are associated with neuropsychiatric illness, actually. So to kind of recap the points of this talk, early adversity can lead to premature activation of neural, endocrine, and reproductive pathways. Biological systems may be geared toward threat management. Intergenerational transmission of epigenetic markers can promote resilience in offspring, but it may prove maladaptive if the stress system is activated beyond the risks posed by the environment. And continued input from the environment can confound the role of epigenetic transmission in humans. So Selma Freiberg stated, in every nursery there are ghosts. They are the visitors from the unremembered past of the parents. But are these ghosts explained by epigenetic markers, neural circuits, cortisol? It's hard to say, and nature's ways may never be fully known. But what we do know is that even after we depart and become ghosts ourselves, we will remain alive in those we leave behind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miller. I'm not sure that we're going to have time for people to ask questions, but as a reminder, Dr. Miller mentioned that he's welcome to you emailing him questions directly. And I think Rachel put his email address in the chat as a reminder. So we'll take a quick break and be back at 9:20. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dr. Miller.
Thank you.
I was wrong. 9:15. We'll be back at 9:15.
Okay, so I'm here to present Dr. David Bakunle. He is somebody I met at Hopkins. He is somebody who is a mercenary for change, employing any skill and occupying any space to help elevate everyone divested from their truest self, especially those who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. David serves as adjunct assistant professor at the University of Florida Center for Arts and Medicine and associate faculty in the mental health department of the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. David's interests include stressors within the built environment, societal manifestations of racism, and the use of arts and culture to strengthen health, equity, and ultimately liberation. Additionally, David has applied artistic and cultural practices such as Black storytelling, African drumming, singing, and theater in the proclamation of his truth for over 20 years, collaborating primarily with organizations in the Baltimore, D.C. region. Among many affiliations, David is co-founder and CEO of Discover Me, Recover Me, an organization that utilizes the African oral tradition to empower use of narrative for healing and growth. He also serves as chair of the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the first state-level commission in the U.S. dedicated to chronicling and bringing justice to racial terror lynchings. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, David. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Anne Marie. I appreciate this opportunity. Greetings to everyone. It is great to have you in this space. I'm honored to be able to have this time together to share my story and hopefully help add to yours, because that's what this is all about. So I'm going to go ahead and get started and share my screen here. All right. This thing out the way. There we go. All right, so I titled this presentation The Lion Side, the utilization of art for transformation and health. So one thing I'm gonna say right now, it's 9:19 in the morning. I don't know what time y'all get started, but I don't typically get started this time in the morning. So I appreciate your energy. I appreciate your questions, your feedback. You can talk to me. This is not a seminar. This is not a lecture. This is a conversation. So I would love to hear your feedback, your thoughts, your insight. I want to learn from you as much as you'll learn from me. All right? So organizers, if there are any questions or things that come up in the chat, please let me know. Don't hesitate to stop me. So before I really get into anything that I discuss, it's important for you all to know who I am. These pictures are just a small collage of who I am. I am Dorlee's husband. I am Cruz Matisse's father. I am Taiwo and Deborah's son. I am Mary's brother. I am an African drummer. I am a storyteller, and I am an academic and a researcher. All of these things make up the tapestry of who I am as a person, occupying this brief time on Earth. One of the things I encourage you all to think about is, what does your audience know about you? When you get the chance to speak, when you get the chance to talk, do they just know your science, or do they know a little bit about you? Part of getting to know my science and the work that I do is getting to know me. So they are one and the same. And I can attest that it goes a long way to helping your audience really get to connect with everything about you and the work that you do. There was once an elder woman, and every day this woman would walk through the forest. It was her refuge. It was her sanctuary. It was where she felt closest to the divine. One day, as she was taking her daily pilgrimage, she came across a stone. And this stone was unlike anything she had ever seen before in her life. Now, mind you, as an elder woman, she had seen many stones in her journeys. So she knew there was something special about this one. So what did she decide to do? She picked up that stone, she put it in her pouch, and she kept walking. As she continued on her journey, she came across a young man. And as that young man approached the elder woman, he could see for himself, or for herself, that he was going through some things. He looked tired. He looked thirsty. He looked hungry. He looked like he had been in a fight or two. Anything that life was dealing this young man, he was coming up on the losing side every time. When the young man finally approached the elder woman, he begged her, "Ma'am, do you have anything that I can eat? Do you have anything that I can drink? Any water, anything? Can you help me, please?" But it wasn't long until that young man caught gaze of that precious stone. And when he did, he no longer thought about his hunger. He no longer thought about his thirst. He no longer thought about his pain. There was only one thing on his mind. And so he asked the elder woman, "Ma'am, may I have that stone that's in your pouch?" And without any hesitation, as if she didn't take a single thought, she reached into her purse, her pouch. She picked up the stone. She gave it to the young man, and she kept walking. Never said a word. So the elder woman is going in one direction. The young man is going in the opposite direction. The young man is holding that stone in his hands, and he hasn't taken his eyes off of it once. He's thinking to himself, with this stone, I will never be tired again. With this stone, I will never be hungry again. With this stone, I will never be thirsty again. With this stone, no one will ever lay a hand on me. With this stone, anything that I have ever wanted, I will get. But after a while, he stopped right in his tracks. It was as if he had seen and taken in the forest for the first time in his journey. The sights, the sounds, the taste, the smell, the touch. And after a while, he turned around and he ran back to that elder woman. And when he did, this is what he said. "Ma'am, I want to return this stone to you because I want whatever it is inside of you that allowed you to give me this stone so freely." This story, The Precious Stone, captures the essence of not only my organization, Discover Me, Recover Me, but it captures the essence of what I do as a public health professional. So as you heard, I occupy many spaces, whether it be in academia, whether it be in government, whether it be in arts and culture, whether it be in advocacy and activism. All of those things work collectively. Because the point of all this for me is that I want everyone I have the honor of connecting with to live as happy a life as possible. We only have one shot at this. Why not make the best of it? Why not be as happy as we can while doing it? So when it comes to addressing the challenges of our society, for which there are many, be it in medicine or be it in public health, I encourage us all to focus on those aspects of who we are as people. Now, this is not meant to sound lovey-dovey. This is health. This is health. This is another form of medicine. And this can work holistically so that the people we are charged to serve in these fields receive the best form of care and attention and consideration from us. So as much as we can bring our intelligence, our education, our techniques, we can simply bring us. And that can make all the difference in the world. I also tell the story because I can't not think of this woman when I do the work that I do. The reason Anne-Marie invited me to this, the reason I get invited to any talks, to any opportunity to tell my story is because this woman saw a story in me that I didn't see in myself. Mary Carter Smith, born in Birmingham, Alabama, eventually made her way to Baltimore. Fun fact, she was a friend of Langston Hughes during the Harlem Renaissance. That's how cool this lady was. She heard a story from a 9-year-old boy that she had previously told on her radio show. And she was so impressed that she decided to talk about that little boy the next week on her radio show. And after a while, she invited that little boy to read stories with her live on air. And in the midst of that connection, she took me under her wing. I was that little boy, by the way, and taught me the art and science of storytelling. And if you would have told me that that chance moment in 1997, and I'm dating myself, would have completely altered the trajectory of my life, I would have never believed you. But it did, and it continues to do that. So honor and remembrance are very important to me, and I'm sure they're important to all of you. So as we continue to navigate our careers as successful and as prosperous as they will be, take a moment to remember the people that got you here. I must honor Mary Carter Smith because she is one of the primary reasons I stand before you today, and I am always grateful to her. Now, let's talk about why we're here. We're looking at the impact of addicted families. In order to talk about that impact, the consequences that we've been dealing with for generations, we need to talk about the genesis of all this, the war on drugs. I'm going to read this quote. Maybe some of you are familiar with this quote, but if you're not, here it goes. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. The war on drugs was a war on Black people, people of lower income, and the left. If you didn't know that, now you know. So much of the damage that we have seen because of the war on drugs was intentional in order to break up alternative sources of power in the United States. 1968 was a very consequential year in this country. We had the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and all the things that rose up after that all across the country, including Baltimore. Ask the elders about the riots in 68. They'll tell you the stories. And we see what was looking to be suppressed during that time. This was during the time of the Vietnam War. You had a rise up against things that were happening domestically and abroad in this country. And the Nixon administration sought to explicitly vilify and criminalize drugs by associating with certain people, including Black people. And if you look at this chart that I have here, you see the steep increase in incarceration after Nixon declared a war on drugs. And 50 plus years later, we are dealing with those consequences and then some. Another story that you must know is, and it's controversial, and of course we would never expect for it to be 100% confirmed, but the proliferation of crack cocaine in Black communities in the 80s through the CIA, supporting Nicaragua as they were combating Sandinistas. I know this sounds out there, but it's true. It sounds unbelievable to think that your own government could be so inconsiderate of your humanity, but they have been. And we as public health professionals and doctors and medical professionals are dealing with the consequences of an intentional war against people of color in this country. It's important to know the context when you are addressing these ramifications. The use of drugs are not a moral failure. The use of drugs, the abuse of drugs, is a public health crisis, and we need to treat it as such. We should have treated it as such back then, but we did not. So our time is now to look at this through the proper lens, and that's why I share this with you. Now to provide another background. this intersectionality of arts and health, arts and medicine. So as Anne-Marie mentioned, I work at the University of Florida in the Center for Arts and Medicine. I'm gonna tell you right now, I didn't even know this field existed 2 years ago. So it just shows how much is still developing in our field, and that should get you all excited. I hope you all don't feel bored or stagnated. And if you do, just hang out with me for a couple hours and I'll get you excited. What brings me joy, what makes my heart sing, is that I've been able to combine my artistry and my scientific acumen. And in many ways, they are one and the same. Art is science and science is art. So to my people out there who are artists, who have creativity, who may play the piano or play the drums or sing or dance or do theater, you can bring that right along with you into your medical profession. You can bring that right along with you into your public health profession. Why? Because at least from a public health standpoint, we are in the 5th wave of health, and that's culture. What are those aspects, those minutiae about our lived experiences that make the difference in our health trajectories? Because they do. So why does arts and health work? Because it does. I'm encouraging you all to be unapologetic about your humanity when you are working in the fields that you're working in, especially when it comes to dealing with the war on drugs and when it comes to dealing with the ramifications of addiction. I've been in Baltimore my whole life. Everybody's got an addiction story. My aunt has been in recovery for over 30 years. So it's not just the person who's been abusing the drugs, it's the families that are affected by this trauma, but can also be strengthened by the recovery and the healing. And I'll get to that shortly. So what we are seeing now is a realization of how our context, not bias. I know many of us have been conditioned to think of bias as a bad thing. First and foremost, it's not bias, it's context. That's a good thing. That's what we need to understand in order to improve our services and our research and our policies when it comes to the people that we serve. That is exactly what we need in this space right now. We've all been affected by the pandemic. I'm in front of a computer screen as opposed to downtown talking to you all in person. It has affected our feelings, our thoughts, our behaviors, and then some. What are those aspects of our cultures, of our lived experience that are helping us to navigate this moment right now, of which we are all affected? That's what we need to know. That's what we need to embrace. And art has always been a methodology. Yes, I'm using that term. A methodology has been an approach that encourages, cultivates, and captures the essences of the human experience. When it comes to human beings, we are dynamic. We cannot always be quantified. Yes, you can quantify how I look, you can quantify my makeup, but you cannot quantify who I am. And I certainly cannot quantify who you all are. So I need to understand your context. Arts and culture helps us to do that. So now let me transition to who we are. And you notice that I'm saying our and us and we, although it's just me here. The reason I'm saying that is because the work that I do, particularly in recovery from trauma, for which addiction is a part of that, is not just me. Discover Me, Recover Me is an organization that I started with my mother. So yes, I am a mama's boy, loud and proud. And I had the opportunity to create this organization with a fellow storyteller, my mother. Makes all the sense in the world. So once upon a time, in a city on the East Coast, a lady and her son came to help a small community of men and women in their struggle for change. So Discover Me, Recover Me started at Johns Hopkins in the Bloomberg School of Public Health during my first year at grad school. I took a class called Gaps and Opportunities in Public Mental Health. And the instructor found out I was a storyteller and encouraged me to work with a recovery center, a substance abuse recovery center in West Baltimore for my practicum. And I was hesitant only because I just got to Hopkins, best public health school in the world, sorry, Maryland. Love y'all though, alma mater. And I was convinced that the only way that I could survive and thrive in the public health space was to be a researcher. So I wanted to focus on my epidemiological training. But she insisted, and I said, okay, I'll do this, and it changed everything. I was able to bring my skills as a griot and a jali into the public health space. And if you aren't familiar with griots and jalis are the keepers of the culture in many African communities, particularly in West Africa. So you may think of a griot as just a storyteller, but they are so much more. They are historians. They are spokespersons. They are teachers, praise singers, masters and mistresses of ceremonies. So all these things that are within our various cultures, within our various communities, we have those people that know all the stories of the family. We have those people who usually will speak up for the community. We have our teachers. We have those people that will always be rah-rah. That is what the griot and the jali does for the community. So I was able to bring that to West Baltimore in the realm of substance abuse recovery. So why storytelling? This may seem like way out in left field to a lot of people. That's fine. I love that. But why storytelling? The first step to wisdom is silence. The second is listening. You are all storytellers. Is there anybody out there that wants to challenge me on the notion that they're not a storyteller? Please feel free to speak. Feel free to put something in the chat. Again, this is a conversation, not a lecture. Does anyone genuinely think that they are not a storyteller? Oh, nobody wants to speak. Nobody wants to speak? Okay. So then you all believe me then. You are all storytellers, which is good. I like that. Storytelling is a universal art form. We all do it. It is one of those things that is inherent to our human experience. It's telling our story, expressing our narrative. So you can be from the continent of Africa, you can be from the continent of Europe, you can be from the continent of South America, the continent of Asia, the continent of North America, Australia, even Antarctica. We all tell stories. That is what we do as human beings. Voice is power. One of the things that we're seeing in our current moment is the elevation of voice. Voices that have been suppressed, voices that have been oppressed are now activating a power that they haven't activated before. And you're seeing conversations around race, around racism, around the ramifications of the war on drugs, around mass incarceration, around the opioid epidemic. These conversations, these voices that are being heard that we weren't listening to before, as professionals, as medical professionals, as public health professionals, power is being activated. And one of the simplest ways to activate power is to let someone speak their voice, to use their voice. So it truly is powerful. Listening is acknowledgement. So it's one thing to hear somebody. That's just something that the ear is capable of doing. Listening is intentional. That involves this: the willingness to internalize someone's message, someone's narrative. So as much as storytelling is important, story listening is just as important. And it's a mutually beneficial exchange. So anytime I get to speak with someone, I get to listen to their story, I grow, I change, I improve because of that story, and vice versa. So one of the things that storytelling forces us to get out of is that idea of zero-sum game. Not a zero-sum game. With storytelling, everybody can win. That's one of the beautiful things about it. So I want to leave you all. With some skills. All right. So I want you all to know what goes into a story. What makes a story a story? So you have the plot. The plot is the point of it all. So think of it as that last sentence of our papers. So any of our peer review papers, I'm sure we got plenty in the house. That last sentence or last paragraph that really tries to capture the essence of everything that was discussed in your paper. Think of that as the plot. The structure: beginning, middle, end. Every story has one. So think about the way that we write our papers. We have our what? Our introduction, background. We have our methods section. We have our results section, and we have our discussion. Beginning, middle, end. Within the story, we have the different components. The title makes a difference. I'm sure many of you think about the titles of your articles as much as I do. You want to have a good title to capture your audience. The scenery and the surroundings. Well, where we're doing our research, that's the scenery and the surroundings. Or where we are working, that's our scenery and surroundings. The characters, that's our population. The challenges, what are we researching? What are we doing our practice in? And our resolutions, how are we addressing the issue? So when it comes to dealing with addiction, when it comes to dealing with the trauma of substance abuse, all these aspects of story are intentional, should be intentional. These are things that we can use to help strengthen that process of recovery and healing. And that's what it's about. Storytelling allows for healing. That's why we must share, whether it's with ourselves, our family, our friends, colleagues, associates, whoever. These things are important. The 3 R's of storytelling: reason, responsibility, and respect. So when we use storytelling as a healing practice, we keep these things in mind. We want the audience to understand exactly what the story is about. Even if it's on one level and then we get to a deeper level, we still want them to understand. Responsibility. It is a responsibility to help guide your audience in your story. You don't want to just leave things out there and leave it to their own devices. You don't have to necessarily explain everything, but you want to give guidelines. You want to give some guidance as to what the audience is to take from your story. That's a responsibility. And respect. Respect your audience. Respect your fellow human being. It's as simple as that. And the 5 tools of storytelling: voice, body, mind, imagination, and connection. That's the magic of storytelling. So when you are looking to help a person reflect on their narrative, when you're looking to help a person guide themselves through their own journey, which is what Discover Me, Recover Me does, the connection is what makes the difference. This is not about trivializing. This is not about being performative. This is about holding someone's hand as they take this introspective journey, which can be difficult. It can be very difficult. It can be painful. And this is not meant to inflict more pain, but this is to show that within that story, there is so much wisdom, there is so much guidance that can help with the process of recovering from the damage and trauma that addiction brings. Does that make sense? Let me know now. Let me know. I want to make sure you all understand. Again, respect. Respect, responsibility. It is my responsibility to make sure that you're understanding what I'm talking about. So please let me know if you have any questions. I want to hear from you all, okay? Let me ramble on too long. So getting into Discover Me, Recover Me versus 12-step. Now, as I mentioned before, my aunt has been in recovery my entire life. I grew up in the rooms of Narcotics Anonymous. So even before I found this space in an official capacity, I grew up in it. On Saturday afternoons, you would find me and my sister and my mother supporting my aunt's recovery in these women's rap meetings, which were women-only Narcotics Anonymous meetings. So listening to the stories of women in their recovery. And even for a little kid like me who definitely didn't understand all the depths of where addiction takes you, it's compelling. You remember stuff like that. It was raw, it was genuine, it was powerful. So a lot of Discover Me, Recover Me has its spirit from the 12-step process and particularly Narcotics Anonymous. The difference between Discover Me, Recover Me and what you see in NA or AA meetings is that we as the facilitators bring the stories. So Narcotics Anonymous is about volunteership. So whoever volunteers to tell their story can do so. In this case, we bring the stories from, in our case, the African oral tradition. So we will find folk tales that solicit thought, makes you think, and that helps to begin the process. Secondly, it's direct and intentional storytelling. So you may get some storytelling in a meeting, but not necessarily. in this case, if you are in a session with Discover Me, Recover Me, you will get storytelling. That is the point. It's for us to tell our stories. And then it operates in the lens of positive intrinsic qualities. So if you've ever been to a NA or AA meeting, it can be rough. People are sharing their truth, and a lot of times they are sharing some of the darker aspects of their truth in their journeys. And that can be tough. What we have decided to do is to flip the script. If you are in recovery from addiction, it is very likely that you have done things that are unproductive, that are things that are unhealthy. We take that as a given, but let's focus on the positive aspects of who you are rather than the negative behaviors that you exhibited. So it's a reallocation of power. It really, really is. We are saying that we are not judging you. We are not focusing on, again, the maladaptive behaviors. I heard that earlier, the maladaptive behaviors. We are focusing on the beneficial qualities. And I'll show you what that looks like. So where do we get these stories from? A lot of these stories come from life experiences. And what I was mentioning earlier is that we should all be encouraged and empowered to include our personal context in the work that we do. It is not biased. Again, it's contextual. I will never deny the experiences that you all have had, no matter how I may feel about it. I respect that it's your context. That is what we should do for those that we serve. So those stories that we may share and those stories that we may hear come from our lives. One of the greatest repositories that we have is this experience that we are currently living. We also get stories from compilations. So there are a plethora of books with folk tales from around the world that speak to a aspect of our experience now. The ancestors had a lot of things figured out, and we can continue to learn from those things now. And many times we can find them in their stories. And also, the internet can be your best friend. If you are looking up a particular story that focuses on a particular truth or a particular moral or lesson, you can find it on the internet. Do it all the time. Totally cool. So this idea of intrinsic worth, getting back to that. Thoughts become words, words become actions, actions become character, character is everything. One of the things that I enjoy about intrinsic worth is that it manifests in many different ways. So depending on our cultural, our spiritual, our just kind of lived experience, we may think of these things in different ways. So if you're of the Christian faith, the fruit of the spirit, love is kind, love is honest, love never fails, things of that matter. The Nguzo Saba, if you're familiar with the African-American holiday Kwanzaa. So we think about Umoja, which is unity, Kujichagulia, which is self-determination, Ujima, collective work and responsibility, so forth and so forth. And also virtues, which is what we primarily use in our work. So trust, respect, acceptance, understanding, mindfulness, appreciation. If you take the first letter out of all of these words, you get trauma. The point is that even in the midst of what we may consider the worst of ourselves, the worst of our experiences, the worst of our behaviors, there is still the existence of these positive aspects of our nature. The things that can be easy for us to do, but because of our trauma, because of our addiction, because of any challenge that we're facing, we may be divorced from that, but we don't completely lose it. So what I want to do very quickly, I'm just going to go back. Please let me know if the sound is not ideal. I want to play just a brief video. This is something that I did a few years ago when we were looking to get support for a compilation of narratives from the group that I work with first, Recovery and Community over in West Baltimore. So I'm going to play this video. Again, let me know if you all are able to hear it and see it as well. I don't know.
Yes, we can see your video.
Okay. I don't hear the sound, and I think I know why.
The mute icon is on?
Well, I did that, but it's because of my audio setup. I have a weird setup, and I think it's going to not allow for the. Okay, I apologize. Like I mentioned, my audio is weird. So what I will do is I will make this video available to anybody who wants to view it. But really, it's just a collection of the different narratives from some of the clients with whom I worked at Recovery and Community. It's the only tangible, for lack of a better word, evidence of what Discover Me, Recover Me has done, just because we respect the confidentiality of some of the stories that people share, and these clients were willing to share some aspects of their story. Personally, I love seeing this because I miss those clients from Recovery and Community. They were as essential to my success in grad school as any teacher, any professor, any administrator. They were really my support system. So I love being able to share this video. So I will share this with the organizers so you all can view it if you would like. My apologies again for the audio issues. So this will be a personal exercise that you all do, since I don't have the opportunity to hear from you all and see you all. So I'll just trust that you follow me on this. Olodumare was looking down on Earth, and Olodumare was displeased at what he saw. He saw pain, he saw violence, he saw disruption, he saw chaos. This is not what Olodumare wanted Earth and its people to be. And he was so angry that he thought, I must wipe the slate clean, I must destroy this Earth and start again. The Orishas begged Olodumare not to do that. They pleaded with him, give the people another chance. So they decided that they would go all over the Earth to find someone who was worthy of the lessons of the Orishas. Now, if you're not familiar with the Orishas, they are the manifestations of Olodumare, which in the Yoruba tradition is considered God. They manifest wisdom, they manifest earth, they manifest femininity. So many aspects of life come through these Orishas. So the Orishas went down to earth looking for one person, just one person who was worthy of their lessons. They went 6 times and could not find one. But the 7th time, they came across a baby, still being nursed by its mother. And the Orisha said, this baby is worthy to learn these lessons. So they took that baby up to the sky, and they taught that baby all the lessons that they had to offer. By the time that baby was brought back down to earth, once the lessons were all taught, that baby was an elder. That's how long he was gone. And his task was to go to the people and to share these lessons that he learned from the Orishas. So my question to you is, what would be the lessons that the Orishas taught this baby, now elder, to share with the people of the world? So it's a thought exercise. It's an introspective exercise. What would be so important to teach his fellow human beings that he got these lessons directly from the Orishas? Now, when I do this exercise with various audiences, it doesn't matter what their background is, it doesn't matter what their qualifications are, it doesn't matter what education they receive, I always get the same answers. I'll get answers like honesty, generosity, respect, understanding, love, diligence, humor, humility, modesty, on and on and on and on and on. It never ceases to amaze me that I always seem to get the same responses. And that is the point. I know I'm going to get the same responses because at the end of the day, as human beings, so this is not doctor to doctor, this is not medical professional to public health professional, this is David talking to his fellow human beings. At the end of the day, we all want the same things. We want to be acknowledged, we want to be appreciated, we want to be respected, we want to be understood, and we want to be loved. Hopefully I'm having some head nods out there. Again, don't look at this through the eyes of your profession. Look at this through the eyes of your humanity. That's what I'm asking for right now. That's what we want. And the way that we express those things for others is through the work that we do. I hope, I truly hope that we are all doing this work because we care about our fellow human beings. We want them to be as healthy and as happy as they can be. And when we are dealing with something like the war on drugs and the generations of trauma and pain that have been inflicted on communities all across this country, all across this world, that was an international affair, particularly communities of color, particularly Black communities, particularly communities like mine, growing up in East Baltimore, that have been affected by generations of trauma that have manifested in addiction, that have exactly. I know that these are the experiences that you see, and it's multiplicative. Again, it doesn't go away with the past generation. It just is added on or multiplied with the next generation. Mass incarceration doesn't just affect the person who's incarcerated. It affects the families of the incarcerated and all the things that are prevented when you have a record to your name. It begets more trauma because it just reduces the opportunities that people have. So that vicious cycle, that vicious trauma just remains. So when we are doing our work, whether in the medical field, the public health field, the health, whatever the case may be, let's continue to remind ourselves of those core truths. Remind ourselves of what I call those existential determinants of health. And if we do that, we can aid our fellow human beings in their healing from trauma, in their healing from addiction, in a holistic and healthy way. And the stories, their narratives, your narratives, the narratives of cultures, the narratives of traditions can help us with that. Let us not be too proud. Let us not be too arrogant. Let us not be too pretentious to not use all the tools at our disposal to address this generational issue. Arts and culture is a tool readily at our disposal to help address the damages, the continuing damages, the perpetual damages that have been inflicted upon many communities because of addiction. So how this story ends. If you remember nothing else from this opportunity, this moment that I've had with you all, please know that I encourage you, I implore you, I beg you to tell your story. Your narrative, your story, your journey is valid. And I don't just mean your professional journey, I mean your personal journey. How you have navigated this thing called life, how you continue to navigate this thing called life is so important. And so many of your fellow human beings are figuring it out just like you are. And that acknowledgement can go a long way to helping address the other issues that they may be dealing with. Be unapologetic about your creativity. I know I have creative people out there right now. And I'm sure so many of you have thought that you had to divorce yourselves of your creativity to be successful in the field that you're in. That is a lie. You can be as creative and as artistic as you want and still be a good doctor, and still be a good researcher, and still be a good professor, and still be a good professional. I know because that's what I'm doing. And I'm confident that you all are just as capable as I am to be as creative as you want in your field. And oh, by the way, it's exactly what you need. You're smart, you can do it all, or at least a lot. And art in its purest form is equity and liberation. We need this. We need this to help our fellow human beings address these perpetual traumas that they deal with. And I'll close with this. I know we're on time. Until the lion tells his side of the story, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Tell your story, because if you don't, someone else will. Equip the people you serve to tell their stories, because no one should be telling their stories for them. So thank you all. I appreciate your time and your attention and your energy. This has been a lot of fun. Please feel free to reach out to me if I can ever be of any service. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Bakunle. We have some questions in the chat, and it looks like we have until maybe another 5 minutes or so. And I encourage other people to put questions in the chat, as right now about 3/4 of them are my own personal questions. So sorry about that. One question, I think referring to trainees, often meet people coping with addiction in the emergency department or an inpatient hospital setting. Do you have strategies or tips for making people feel comfortable enough to share their truths when you haven't had a lot of time to establish rapport before meeting them?
Yes, so I would say this is where I encourage you all to work on your vulnerability. So what makes me successful, however you want to define success, is that I'm willing to tell aspects of my story that maybe several years ago I would have never told a soul. And it's not to be a sob story. That's not the point. It's just that it's not natural for us to be vulnerable. So if we model the behavior, people will feel that much more comfortable being open. No one wants to, you can't just ask a person, tell me your deepest, darkest secret. Tell me the horrible parts of your life. No, it don't work that way, because it doesn't work on us. Again, this is where the humanity comes in. It's like, think of yourselves. Would you want somebody to ask you that? No. So don't do it to other people. You know the situation. You may know the circumstances, but just think about how a person may be feeling. Empathy. Maybe that's the word I'm looking for. It's empathy. So if you can see, if you are hearing that a person is dealing with pain, is dealing with frustration, is dealing with chaos, you all know what that feels like in some form or fashion. It may not be the same way that they have experienced it, but you've experienced it. That's what empathy is. It's I understand what you're going through. And it doesn't have to be exactly what they're going through. It's the feelings that they are having. I understand your pain. I understand your frustration. I understand your hopelessness. It helps when people hear that someone understands, like they get it. And that in itself can help a person open up. A lot. Anytime I come into these spaces, you're all strangers. I do my best to hopefully make us a little bit closer by telling my story. To remind you, yes, you may call me Dr. Bakunle, but I want you to know David. I want you to know that guy. And hopefully in the spirit of reciprocity and openness and comfort, you let me all get to know you as well. So that's what and you never know. Again, sometimes it can be a simple story. It can be a collection of stories, but make yourself available to your patients. Make yourself available to those who you're serving.
I think I'm just going to follow up with that real quick. Oftentimes we're taught to sort of hide ourselves in psychiatry to serve as this sort of like neutral, we absorb your stories without coloring it with our own sort of experiences. And so I think the idea of sharing stories can sometimes be sort of foreign to us. And one thing that I personally struggle with is just, I've lived such a privileged life compared to the vast majority of the people that I work with that sometimes it's hard to imagine that anything that I could share would be relevant or useful or comforting or whatever, and not just like a smack in the face.
I understand that feeling, and Thank you for acknowledging that. Because, yeah, there are a lot of people, particularly white people, that feel that because they are privileged, they have nothing to offer. That's a lie. Your whiteness does not stop you from dealing with the things that's called life. You just don't have to worry about being white. That's really the fundamental difference. You're a woman, so same thing. You know, you have to worry about being a woman. I'm sorry, that comes with its challenges. I've learned from my mother and my wife. It comes with challenges. That's your context. So again, don't disregard it. I'm not. I wouldn't tell any white person to necessarily apologize. Acknowledge that you're privileged. Work to eliminate the privilege because it's come on the backs of other people's oppression, but it's still your context. And acknowledge that context. So Jane, you have absolutely a lot of things to offer. And I love psychology. I was a psych major as an undergrad. I did it because, and this is the wild west of the internet, so back in the early 2000s when you were talking to anybody, I was like, seriously, you didn't know who you were talking to. I was good at listening to people's stories and helping them to decipher them, come up with some solution or some way to address it. So I figured I might as well learn it officially and get paid for it. So that's why I got into psychology and eventually mental health. But part of what I think made me good at it is I was able to relate it to my own experiences. And I'm going to guess that person didn't necessarily care that I was a black man or a black kid when I did it. They just cared that I had some form of reference to help guide them on their journey. So I get that psychology and psychiatry teach us to be neutral. We aren't neutral. You talk about big lie. That's the big lie, that we're neutral. No. That we're objective. No, we're not. And it's okay. But we do have commonalities in our human experiences that can help other human beings navigate their journeys. That's what I want people to be comfortable with. And again, I don't want you, if I'm in your chair, I don't want you to give me a paper to explain that. Just tell me your story. Just tell me your experience. That is what I can relate to. And I'm sure that's what other people can relate to. So it is a practice. It is a practice, and it's antithetical to our training. That's why it's hard. So it really comes down to a decision that you make, and are you comfortable making that decision? And do you have support? Like, it's hard to go against the grain by yourself. You gotta have some form of support, at least somebody who will give it a chance. Anything that I've done with storytelling and public health is because someone gave me a chance. Yes, I may have had my convictions, but I was just a grad student. Who's going to listen to a grad student? Oh, he's just a postdoc. Who's going to listen to a postdoc? Oh, he's just an adjunct. Who's going to listen to an adjunct? All these things that could give people legit reasons not to take me seriously, but they didn't use them. They believed in me first and foremost, because that's what this is about. They believe in what storytelling can do, and they gave it an opportunity. And that's when our creativity, our conviction, our determination can let us just run with it. And that is my story in a nutshell. People gave me a shot, and I ran with it.
Thank you so much. It's my fault. We're running over. So we'll have to take a very quick break because we need to start on time for our next talk. But thank you so much. I really appreciate your talk. This was great.
Thank you all. Appreciate your time. Have a great one.
Oh. Okay. Hey everyone. So, I mean, if you need to run off and take a quick break, that's fine. But just to keep everyone on time and keep the day moving, because we want to make sure that all our speakers have adequate time to share their story, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our three panelists who we have the privilege of speaking with today. So, first off, we have Quintina Felder, who is a contract specialist for the University of Maryland, Baltimore Strategic Sourcing and Acquisition Services. Prior to UMB, Quintina worked for the University of Maryland Medical System for 9 years as a contract specialist in procurement. Tina, as she is affectionately known by her peers, grew up in the heart of Baltimore City, not too far from the campus Sandtown, Pennsylvania Avenue area. Tina plans to share her story of being a daughter of a mother who struggled with addiction and of multiple other family members who fought with addiction. Next, we have Will Hinman, CPRS, who is a peer recovery support specialist with the University with the Maryland Center of Excellence on Problem Gambling, also known as the Center. As a peer for the center, will assist individuals within Maryland struggling with gambling problems and gambling addiction to navigate recovery treatment resources and helps to remove any barriers to recovery. He comes from a background of over 30 years of customer service, managerial, and sales experience. Will has a passion for working with others and sharing his personal experience in gambling recovery. And last but certainly not least, we have Toni Torres, who usually introduces herself as just a mom. Toni was born to Italian-Irish parents and raised in Baltimore, where as first-generation Americans, she and her 4 siblings attended both parochial and public schools. Married for 38 years to Cal, they are parents to 3 sons, John, Danny, and Austin. She has been a Maryland State employee for 40 years, training staff and facilitating cognitive programs for delinquent youth. After suffering the devastating loss of her son, Dan, in 2010, Toni started the first GRASP, also known as Grief Recovery After Substance Passing, chapter in Maryland, where she utilizes her experience to provide support and insight to families on their journey through grief. Toni also started the Daniel Carl Torres Foundation, a nonprofit whose mission is to provide overdose prevention, awareness, and harm reduction programs, and charitable assistance to low-income persons seeking substance abuse treatment and sober living. She was instrumental in getting the Overdose Response Program bill passed that now enables families and individuals access to the life-saving overdose reversal drug naloxone, which I'm sure many of us have heard of. She worked to address issues faced by those suffering in addiction and their families, concentrating on Baltimore County, since suburban drug use is often marginalized in the face of urban drug use. The Daniel Carl Torres Foundation works to increase access to drug treatment, particularly on-demand detox and long-term treatment, while advocating for more overdose prevention, legislation, and harm reduction programming. So if everyone, please join me in welcoming Toni, Will, and Quintina. Thank you.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Quintina Felder. And when I say triple threat, I do not use the words loosely. Excuse me. The trauma of substance abuse has touched my family 3 times fold. And when I say 3 times fold, meaning my mother, my daughter's father, and my husband. I grew up in the inner city of Baltimore, and I remember as a child, substance abuse plagued my family from aunts, uncles, cousins, neighborhood family, and friends. And I remember as a child asking my mom, seeing her struggle with substance abuse. My mother waited until she was like in her 30s to start using. And I remember asking her, why did she turn to substance abuse? And her excuse were to lose weight because she was fairly obese. So that's the answer that she gave me, to lose weight. But I always felt it was a lot deeper than what she was truly admitting. She struggled throughout the years with substance abuse. Sometimes, it was worse than others. But what I felt she couldn't understand was changing people, places, and things. She had a hard time letting family go. And to me, I always felt like family was her struggle. Family was her downfall because she had sisters and she had brothers, her siblings used. So each and every time that my brother and I would try to put her in a different environment, or we would try to help her get clean, she would still gravitate to family because family is all she knew. Family is all she had. So she would struggle with letting family go. And ultimately, in December 2020, she lost her battle with substance abuse. She passed away from fentanyl poisoning because able to let a family member go, and the family is what brought it to her because she could barely walk or barely get around. So a family member brought the substance to her home, and she wound up losing her battle with substance abuse there. In July of 2020, my daughter lost her father. Now, he was a man that I was with since high school. I stayed with him for 23 years. He struggled for a number of years from substance abuse. He was in the military, in the Navy. He served during the time of Persian Gulf. He actually started using, while in the military, as a coping mechanism. He was in and out of Veteran Affairs, Volunteer Service of America, Prairieville. He went to Philadelphia to drug treatment recovery in Philadelphia, and that's where he lost his battle in July 2020. Because his drug of choice was crack, and it was laced with fentanyl. Now, in 2016, I married my husband. My husband also struggled with substance abuse, and he struggled with substance abuse from the age of 15 up until 2016. 2016 was the year, I would say, one, I got married, and then it also was the year of chaos, because we went from marriage, having a happy marriage, to my world just crumbling right before my eyes, and I had no say-so in the situation. With that being said, my husband wound up turning back to drugs in 2016. I was determined not to allow his substance abuse to pull him back in. I sent my husband to California, and I sent him to California because, one, I wanted him to change people, places, and things. I didn't want him to have access to family, friends. I didn't want him to have access to transportation. I didn't want him to have access to a phone call where someone can just go pick him up, or to someone can send him money, because I knew it was expensive for someone to even send him money to California to get back home. I knew no one that was going to travel to California to visit him or to take him anything, or I knew it just was going to be so hard for him to get home. So therefore, I sent him to California for drug treatment. And when he left for treatment, the key word that I gave him was fight. I said, you not only have to fight for yourself, but you also have a family home that loves you, that cares for you, that you have to continue to fight. It was hard, being away from him for the months that I were away from him, but I knew he had to do it for himself. I couldn't fight the battle for him, because we're talking about a man that has been suffering from substance abuse from the age of 15 and never really had the treatment that he needed. Because not only that my husband needed recovery for his substance abuse, but keep in mind, when a person is dealing with substance abuse, he needed mental, psychological, it's not just physical for his body yearning for it, but he really needed behavioral health. And with that being said, the treatment center that I sent him to, he was able to get everything that he needed. They focus on every aspect of his life from childhood up into 2016. They did meditation, yoga, horseback riding. When my husband came home from being there for 3 months, a different man, he came home a different man. Now, keep in mind, by him being an ex-addict, he struggled with substance abuse every day. It's an everyday battle for him. But and the key word that we use is fight. Fight is an everyday struggle for him. What I will say is my husband is willing and was willing to listen. He was willing to change people, places, the things. He now realized what's most important to him. It's like I said, it's a constant struggle, but he's determined to fight. And I continue to try to be a support system for him. I continue to try to take classes, to continue in therapy, because I too had to get therapy for myself. I too had to figure out why I am drawn to people that use substances. And I had to realize, and I said, is it me? I'm attracted to those type of individuals, but because I have a compassionate spirit, and I'm known to always be willing to help someone, I just was determined with these three individuals that I was determined not to give up on them, because I knew the potential in them when they were clean. I knew the potential in them before they started using. So I myself took classes. I did a lot of research. Eugene is my husband. His therapist in California sent me all types of training manuals, things to read, books, asked me to join different workshops. I myself got into therapy. I even took it upon myself, especially when my mom passed in December. I took a class online that's offered to the public. It's called Alliance of Coalition for Healthy Communities. It's a Save a Life Narcan training where they actually train you to administer Narcan and also send you a packet to help you when you're in those situations, to administer Narcan. And I took the class online, got certified online, and they sent me my training packet. And each time that you use the Narcan or you administer the Narcan to an individual, you can also reach out to them and inform them that you're out of Narcan, and they will actually send you more Narcan. And it's been, I will say, for the trauma, it affected me and my family. I mean, I built up anger, hostility. I became distant, withdrawn, isolated. When my mom passed away in December, I took 4 months off of work because I just couldn't handle the devastation of it. And each time a family member, this one particular family member that was last with her comes around, it's so hard for me to embrace her because I'm so angry. Now, keep in mind, I did not find out my mother's cause of death until the day of her viewing. The day of her viewing, I'm about to walk in to make sure, she looks beautifully, everything is in place. And I get a phone call from the forensic investigator to tell me my mother's actual cause of death. Here, my brother and I thinking she actually passed away because maybe her body was tired because she was on dialysis. And then my aunt had us under the impression that she took Tylenol PM on top of her medication. But once I was walking into the funeral home and I received that phone call, how she passed away, it was so devastating. Now, keep in mind, the family members, we all were together because during family hour, you go and you view the body, your loved one. And it took everything in me not to reach over and choke the life out of the person, the family member that I knew that was last with her. Because I knew that particular family member had to give it to her because it wasn't a secret that they all used. They all were substance abusers. But it was my brother that said, Tina, enough. This is not the time. This is not the place. So I still have not gathered the courage to, and I wouldn't say gather the courage, say I still have not confronted that family member because I'm so afraid of how I may react. And then a part of me feels as though, one, I'm going to be lied to. Two, it's not going to, no matter what answer she provides to me, I'm still not going to be able to get my mother back. It hurts, but you know, I continue to go to therapy. I continue to also get encouragement from my husband, because my husband has walked in my mom's shoes, and um, he also tells me, you know, how to. He also tells me how the process of recovery and how addicts think, and you know how it's okay to feel the way I'm feeling, but also keep in mind, you know, when a person is using and then you have another loved one is using, you know, they're not thinking about the health of someone else, they're thinking about their next fix, you know. So it's been, I will say it's been a struggle. I have, you know, I go online, look at YouTube videos. I stay, you know, I connect to my therapist once a week. I also joined a grief counseling group. I also joined a group with dealing with the loss of loved ones through substance abuse. Um, um, it's a day-to-day struggle, but I'm getting through. I'm getting through. And one of the things that I had my husband is that I would love, now that this has affected my family, I would love to get out into the community or join organizations to help fight, because it's a fight not only for the individuals that uses, but the family that it affects. The family that it affects. And I just thank you for allowing me to share.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate you sharing your story. Tony or Will, I don't know if one of you wants, up to you guys, who wants to go next.
Guess I'll jump in. Hi, that's Tina, that was really a powerful story. And I'm so sorry for the loss of your mom.
Thank you.
So at my introduction, you heard my I'm Tony, and I had 3 sons, and John, Dan, and Austin. And my middle son, Dan, suffered an addiction for about 7 years. And before I can kind of get into what, at the time, what I thought I was living through the worst time of my life and the complete chaos, it really wasn't until my son died that I truly understood what pain was. Pain that I've never known before. I've never experienced that. I found my son responsive, and the members of that day. It's been 10 years, but if I allowed my mind to go there, it would be just as it would happen. I mean, the thoughts of the hospital, and they were trying to lead me into the family room, and I thought, no, I don't want to go in there, because I've heard bad things about going into that family room. And I remember my husband coming to the hospital and saying, what's going on? And he didn't know, he had been at work, and I couldn't even get out the words to say to him. He said, where's Dan? And all I could do was just shake my head. And to watch that man collapse on the floor, watching my other 2 sons cradled and in each other's arms, crying. So those kinds of memories bring back some intense pain. When at the time, so I kind of gauge myself now as before Dan and after Dan. If someone were to say to me, so, hey, did you remember seeing that movie? And I'd say, and I silently, I think to myself, now, was that before Dan died or after? for whatever reason, that is my timeline for now until I guess I close my eyes. But I can tell you when I saw the theme, I guess, of today, the hidden trauma of the addicted family, and that's what it was. It was hidden. It changed everything about my normalcy, my predictability, or it as a whole, I suppose. There were times that I didn't know if I was acting as a parent who were supposed to be as a mom, especially as a nurturer. I turned into a detective and a warden. You live in shame. There were relationships that were damaged. I told no one about what was going on. I never confided. I think there was actually eventually a very close friend that I confided in, but it was my husband and I and our two boys. And even from my other sons, I would hide certain things. So I don't know now if it was, I guess I was ashamed, and I feared that I was going to be judged as a parent. But worse yet, I feared that Dan would be judged. And there you are in that protective mode again. And he even said to me at one time, because we had him in and out of treatment and changing those places that Tina mentioned. And he would say, when I'd come back, he'd say, yeah, I would go into such and such a restaurant. He said, Mom, they know what I am. So he felt that shame. He felt that for a lot. But for us, that when you're in it, when you're at the time, when you're in that chaos, that's the only word I can accurately describe what it felt like. I mean, I had health issues. I had what I know now that was depression. I had, a huge weight gain. At one time, I thought I was having a heart attack, but the doctor eventually said if they took me to the ER, it was anxiety driven. My husband and I, we would be at each other opposite ends. There were times where I would say, that's enough, I need him out of the house. And he would be the one saying, no, we can't do that. We need to keep him here. Or then, Carl would say, that's it. He stole, a family crest ring that my husband, it was the only thing my husband left from his father, was this one ring that had been in his family for generations. And Dan, he pawned it. There were most nights I would sleep with my purse in my bed. And of course the phone was, literally on my chest at night or right beside me, because I was waiting for that call. I think in some kind of sense that maybe I knew that it wasn't going to end well. Maybe I always had hope that it would be better, and that's why we kept trying all these different things. You feel at the time, I felt like I was a prisoner in my own home. Again, with the transportation, like Tina said, I would take his keys, I'd hide his car, sometimes I'd hide my car. Those are some of the things that you become. And it's not a one-time thing in the addicted home. I mean, this is a crisis, and that trauma was cumulative. What I didn't know then was some of the things that I should have been saying. Now I meet parents or families or, some individuals that would say, what would you do differently? And in the beginning, when people would say that to me, I would think, why would they be asking me for my opinion when clearly I failed? I mean, that was my mindset, because it must have been something I did or I didn't do. Like maybe I should have took out another loan for treatment or something else I didn't do. I mean, I've learned some other things since then that probably has saved my life, at least my mental health. But those are the only way I can accurately describe the chaos. At one point, I'm not embarrassed to say, there was a point where I thought, I just can't do it anymore. I'm either going to try to have myself committed or reason things out in my head. Well, if I just end it, they'll all be okay, really, without me, because I don't know how much more of I could take. And then that day came. And no, you're never prepared. Never prepared. Even now, I've said, and other parents we've talked, that I would do it all over in a heartbeat, and I'd have him back with everything that came with it, because now I have a little bit more information and I understand a little bit more. So when I look at things of now or then and now, I mean, that was then, all that chaos. And now is that, I think, first, for one thing, I think stigma is still killing people. People are still have that fear of being judged. This is why some people still won't go to the ER. Even that went through my mind that day, thinking, did they work as hard as they should have on my son? Or did they just look at him and think, ugh, it was just another junkie? I needed to ask nurses to say, what do you see when you see these people coming in and out? Do you say to yourself, oh, this is a frequent flyer? Do you take your time getting to that person, thinking maybe, are you playing God in some cases? I needed someone to say, no, we treat everyone as if it was our own. But it went through my mind. Did they judge him? But I still feel that stigma is killing people because of their fear. So now I'm hoping that, families or caregivers, they're more patient, they're non-judgmental, and it just doesn't stop with families. It's us as a community. And I personally have taken on more of a harm reduction view. I look at things a lot differently now. So to answer that person that said, what would you do differently? Then I would say to Dan, look, I know that it's a possibility that you might fall. So you have to tell me. And don't use alone. Don't have your door locked. I need to check on you. They didn't have Narcan available when that happened. And that's why we got so involved legislatively. Would that have saved him? I don't know, because I wasn't given a chance to know. I know now that when someone enters recovery, when someone enters sobriety, the whole family needs to go. The whole family needs to be in recovery, needs to have self-care. I didn't realize that. I do now. And we have wine with Sunday dinner, or a margarita for Cinco de Mayo. This wasn't just a generational thing. So if that meant that was how it was we were going to support Dan by, when we had a party, that there's no liquor, then there would have been no liquor. But he didn't realize it. Even though there were hints that he would say to me, when he was living in Florida in another treatment facility, he would say, Mom, how many Nar9 meetings have you been to? So I think he was kind of testing me. And I did go to Nar9 meetings. He was kind of testing me. But he also said things also along the way is, if I fall, you're going to have to let me fall. I think he was trying to tell me he didn't have it in him anymore. So I do know that the sooner people get help, the sooner they will start to heal. My husband and I, since we're we have a foundation, it's named after Daniel Carl Torres Foundation, and we help people into treatment and to recovery homes. We fund all kinds of different things. And just recently, we were bringing in materials to make up kits, to make up safe use kits. Well, I have to tell you, my husband, as we're carrying these things in, my husband looks at me and he said, are those tourniquets? And I said, yeah. He goes, well, those little cotton balls, is that what I think it's for? And I'm like, yeah. And he just said, never would I thought that this is where we were. So we're not advocating, we're not giving anyone a free pass to say this is what you continue to use what you're, continue to use all the drugs or all the dope you want. No, it's not what I'm saying. I'm saying we're here to help keep you alive. And our goal is to give you those options to go on to, a healthier lifestyle, get healthy, get into treatment. So life has changed. This certainly wasn't what I expected. What's that saying about if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans? Well, yeah, he definitely had a different plan in mind for myself and really our whole family. My son, my oldest boy, he is a harm reductionist. My youngest he works with families, with Maryland Coalition of Families. So this is it. This is our life now. And we're going to give back as much as we can. So that's me in a nutshell.
Thank you, Tony. That's an amazing story, and we really appreciate it. And again, thank you, Ms. Felder, for also sharing your very vulnerable story as well. So last but not least, we have Will. So the stage is yours.
Hey, thank you so much. And thank you so much for Tony and Quintina for sharing your stories. And I had it written out what I was going to say today, but I'm just going to speak from the heart because I think that's, after hearing y'all's stories, it's just the way I like to go today. And, I was a person that, I'll start by saying that. So I work for the Maryland Center of Excellence on Problem Gambling. I'm a peer recovery sports specialist. So when help seekers call that 1-800-GAMBLER helpline number, I'm there to assist them. I cover Southern Maryland, which is Anne Arundel, Prince George's, Montgomery, Charles, Calvert, and St. Mary's County. I have a very busy region with 2 of the big casinos in my region and all the bingo halls. And gambling has the highest risk of suicide, which I think a lot of people don't know. And I was one of the, I almost took myself out of my mother's life and my kid's life. My gambling and recovery, long recovery, alcoholism and disorder gambling. And it got to the point that it was that I didn't think I had any other but to take my life. And on top of it, I had a life insurance policy, which made me feel like it was justified. I felt like my family, my kids were better off if I did that. I lost everything I'd worked for 25 years, and I was in debt over my head, and I just did not think there was any rebuilding my life. I was also losing the love of my life at the time. We initially separated because of my alcoholism. So what happened was, I went to the University of Maryland. I want to start by saying that, public speaking was my greatest fear in the world. Avoid it at all costs. And when I went to college, I would always avoid taking any sort of classes where I would have to speak in front of a group of people. And I remember I had to take a public speaking class. It was required, and I had a when I had to get up in front of the class and speak. And despite preparing for hours, for it, I remember my lips were trembling. I had sweat pouring down my underarms. My face turned bright red, and I could barely get out the words. And I swore at that moment that I would never put myself in that situation again. So when I graduated and started seeking jobs, I avoided any job where I thought there was any possibility where I would have to speak in front of a group of people. So I just want to tell you, what an honor it is to be here today and be able to share my story, to have that ability. And this is just a gift of recovery, and thank God I made it to the other side. And if I'd found opioid addiction, there's probably a good chance I wouldn't be here today to share my story. And so I'm grateful for that. The only reason I'm able to speak publicly today is because I did a lot of institutional commitments in Alcoholics Anonymous, speaking at psych wards and prisons and rehabilitation centers and leading meetings. Everything I have in my life today is a gift of recovery. So I'm really grateful for that side. But when I started doing step work with my sponsor, and we were reading out the book of it talks about how alcohol is just a symptom of our disease, and that made total sense to me, because when I look back at my life, from the earliest age I can remember being a kid on a big wheel, I just did not feel comfortable in my own skin. I always felt less than, never felt like I was good enough, always felt like I was a kid on the sideline watching all the other kids have fun. And, it was probably, part to do with my childhood. My parents married at a very early age. My mom got pregnant with me when she was 20 years old, and she was in school in Towson. And, she actually even considered abortion and couldn't go through with it. So, married my father that was just out of the service, and he got a job in sales for GE. And we moved from Maryland to Newport News, Virginia. And then at the age of 5 years old, they divorced, and my mom moved us in with our grandparents for a year. So I attended school a little bit there, and then we moved to Cheverly, Maryland. And I did a couple of years in elementary school there, and then she remarried to my stepfather, and I switched schools again. A lot not having a close relationship with my father, and I did not adjust well, to change, and making friends. It just, it took me a long time to warm up and to meet people, and so I found some stability, I guess, from the third grade through middle school in Prince George's County, and sports was definitely my escape. I love playing sports. I love being outside. It was light outside. I was going to be outside playing sports, basketball, football, baseball, soccer, riding my bike, whatever I could do. I was not a kid that could sit still. I didn't enjoy board games or anything like that. I liked to be outside playing, and then in high school, we moved to another county, and I had to reestablish myself as an athlete, and I had to make new friends, and we moved right in the middle of the summer, and the transition was very difficult for me, because still I felt very uncomfortable in my own skin, and so my freshman and sophomore year of high school, I had very few friends. Most of my friends were just on the basketball team or soccer team. I had a couple friends that I hang out with, but other than that, I was told by the girls later on that they stuck up because I would walk around the hallways with a frown on my face. It was that I didn't feel comfortable. I just felt less than. And so I guess my junior year, they started introducing alcohol parties, and I really resisted the temptation. And I had a friend from the basketball team ask me why I didn't drink, and I said, I don't know. I just don't want to, and I don't know if it's because I thought it was bad for me, or if maybe I just intuitively knew it was not going to be good for me. And so again, I felt like the kid on the sideline watching everybody else have fun, and felt very out of place. And then I was dealing with a high school crush that had broken my heart, and I was out with some friends, and my buddy said, you need to drink a beer, just have a beer to relax. And I think I had 2 or 3 beers, and the feeling I got, I just felt so comfortable in my own skin. I felt self-assured, and pretty much from the very beginning, whenever I went out and I started drinking, I would drink to get drunk. I would drink very alcoholically. I was generally the kid that was passed out at the industrial park, or in the bathroom, and drank very alcoholic. My social life took off, my love life took off, and I was able to myself, I was comfortable in my own skin when I was drinking. And then the end of my junior year, I got a job in an Irish pub, and they taught me how to drink like a man. Essentially, if you couldn't drink at this job, you weren't going to make it, and I wasn't even of legal drinking age to drink, but every time I go behind the bar, I was handed a shot, and that's where I found, my social network, friends that I felt with, and I went to the University of Maryland in College Park, and I even lived in the dorms, but I would travel home every weekend to be with these friends, because that's where I felt comfortable. And I had very few friends in college. And then I ended up staying at the job despite despite graduating from college, I had no dreams or aspirations, and I felt like that job was as good as I was ever going to be, and I ended up staying there for 24 years. And there was a lot of fond memories. I met the love of my life there. Back in 2005, we had a beautiful pregnancy and daughter. She too went to the University of Maryland. She had gotten her master's in linguistics. She worked for intelligence. She spoke 4 languages, and I never felt like I was good enough for her. But I did the best I could for 6 years. We had 6 incredibly happy years of marriage. We had my daughter, and we had it was like a honeymoon. We went through the honeymoon phase for about 6 years, and I did the best I could to keep it together. But in 2011, at the end of 2011, that restaurant shut down, and it was my identity. I'd been there since I was 17 years old, and I truly did not believe I could do anything else. And my drinking escalated to a new level, and I ended up separating from my ex-wife initially because of my alcoholism, and then she allowed me to move back in as long as I didn't drink, and my gambling escalated to an all new level. I started playing online blackjack and poker 24/7, and here I am trying to save my marriage. I remember sitting at the dinner table with my computer in front of me playing my poker hands while I'm having dinner with my family. I was just completely consumed with it, and clearly substituting one addiction for the other. So I came down to the computer the next morning. I'd won this huge poker tournament and proclaimed to my ex-wife that I was going to be a professional poker player. And the next morning I came down to my computer to set up, and there was a note next to it saying that I had to leave again, and the marriage was over. And give a problem gambler, the mentality that he has nothing to lose, and that's not a good thing. And it was right around that time that the live gaming tables opened in Maryland. Instead of having to drive into Atlantic City or plan a trip to Vegas, I had a casino in my backyard, and I started going there, as an escape. It made me feel important, and then and one night, it turned into an enormous financial problem, and of course I'd relapsed on alcohol. My judgment was impaired, and I got myself into a complete mess. And when a gambler gets to that situation, they will chase it like a drug habit. They really will. And that's what I did for a few months. And like I said, that do or die day came where I was either going to win or take my life. And fortunately, there was a divine intervention. My family called the police, and I remember when they came in and surrounded me at this casino. I felt just this incredible feeling of relief, because I did, but I just didn't know how to live anymore, and didn't believe there was any way I could reconstruct my life. And so they escorted me to a psych ward, and from there I went to Shepherd Pratt and Towson, and then they escorted me into a 28-day rehabilitation center. And even though I was an alcoholic, I just felt out of place, because I didn't feel like anybody understood me, and I was the only gambler in there. And but they had a guy named Michael Rosen that worked at the center, and this is how I found out about the center. They had him come in and talk to me, and he shared his story with me, and it gave me a little bit of hope. He was tough on me. He gave me some tough love. He didn't tell me what I wanted to hear. He told me what I needed to hear, and he challenged me. So when I got out, they were bringing AA meetings in every night, and I enjoyed hearing the stories, but I don't remember hearing anything about getting a sponsor, getting a home group, working the steps, any of that stuff. And I'm sure they said it. So when I got out, I just didn't know how to stay sober. I knew my gambling run was done. I'd surrendered to the gambling, but I think maybe I convinced myself that maybe I could drink normally again. And I relapsed on alcohol, and life got really unmanageable real quick again. And again, I had a lot of debt I had to face. I had a lot of issues I had to face, and I wasn't going to do it with that person that I was before. I had to reinvent myself, or there was going to be no hope. And fortunately, I was attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings and Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, and I gotten the phone number of a guy at a GA meeting, and I was rarely sharing at any meetings. You know, I just went in and left, you know, and but at this one little GA meeting, there was like 10 people there, and they went around in a circle, and you had to share. You know, you really didn't have an option. So I shared a little bit of my story, and this guy came up to me after the meeting, gave me his phone number, and said, "Hey, if you ever want to go to a meeting or out to lunch, give me a call." And it was a few days after that I relapsed on alcohol, and I was hopeless again, considering suicide. And I said, you know what, maybe I'll call that phone number. And I truly believe that phone number saved my life. You know, he picked me up. I was annihilated drunk. He took me to a meeting. He took me out with a couple other alcoholics after dinner, and they shared their stories with me. And he, not only was he, you know, like I said, he was in Gamblers Anonymous and Alcoholics Anonymous, so he really understood my story. His wife, he was losing his house, you know, and he was a successful attorney in DC. You know, he had been a millionaire. He lost everything. And on top of it, he had embezzled money from his client's account, over $1 million. And yet this guy was telling me everything was going to be okay if I just had an open mind and started taking the suggestions in the program. And I believed him, you know, and that's exactly what I did. So I got a sponsor. I started working the steps. I got a home group. I started doing institutional commitments. Anytime I was called, I was there. And you know, and that, I truly believe that gentleman saved my life. And we remain very close friends today. He ended up serving 13 months of a federal prison sentence. He got off probation last year. He just got a job in recovery. He hasn't gambled or drank since. And those are the people that inspire me, you know, and I'm just real grateful today to be able to share my experience, strength, and hope with others, and hopefully be able to get them on a path to recovery and open their mind up enough to go into treatment or to attend a meeting or whatever they need to do to get their life on path. So I appreciate everybody having me here today. It's been a real honor.
Thank you so much to everyone who spoke today. I don't think we're going to have time for questions. Again, our next talk starts at 11, but I really, really appreciate all three of you sharing. And I think that if people do have questions, if you want to email them, I can pass them on to everyone. Thank you all so much.
Hi, everyone. Sorry for the very short break. We are going to stick by the schedule and be mindful of everyone's time. So I am very happy to welcome Dr. Judith Cohen to speak now. She is a professor of psychiatry at Drexel University College of Medicine and medical director of the Center for Traumatic Stress in Children and Adolescents at Allegheny General Hospital in Pittsburgh. With Doctors Tony Manarino and Esther Dublinger, Dr. Cohen developed and tested the trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, or TFCBT, and evidence-based treatment for traumatized children. This is described in the books Treating Trauma and Traumatic Grief in Children and Adolescents, and Trauma-Focused CBT for Children and Adolescents, Treatment Applications, along with the online training course TFCBT Web. She has served on the board of directors for the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children, the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, and the editorial board of the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. She's currently chair of the ACAP Child Maltreatment and Violence Committee and the National Child Traumatic Stress Network's Child Sexual Abuse and Traumatic Grief Committees. She consults to Sesame Street and the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors to develop resources for traumatically bereaved military children. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks everybody for having me, but what I am not is a tech expert. And right now I can't share my slides. I think you might need to make me a co-host.
Yes. One moment, please.
Or I think Crystal may have my slides. If somebody can put them up, I apologize.
Sure, I'll probably see that. Well, give me 1 second.
I'm going to be talking today. The last presenters, Tina, Tony, and Will, are a very tough act to follow. So thank you so much for sharing your stories. That was so inspirational. I'm going to be talking today about trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy for children with parental substance abuse. Hopefully I'll be able to share slides. If I can't, I'll try to remember them.
You should have the share content icon on your window.
Let's see if I can share. Hold on a second. There
we go.
Okay. Can you see those?
Yes, thank you.
All right, that's good. Now let's see if I can forward them. Oh, wonderful. So this is the inspiration for my talk today. Maya Angelou, do the best you can until you know better, and then when you know better, do better. Hopefully, talking today will help us to know a little better about how to help children. And I really appreciated all of the previous speakers who really helped us understand a little bit about the trauma that children, especially in families, experience when their parents are suffering from substance abuse. And I think especially Tina and Tony, when you were talking about, you know, that call, fearing that when that phone is going to ring, that threat, that danger, and how that feels, and imagining how that feels for the child. So here are my disclosure. I receive grant funding and royalties. I'm not going to talk about any off-label drug use. I don't receive any industry funding. And I hope that you'll be able to at least recognize the TFCBT core components, which are summarized by the acronym PRACTICE, and then recognize additional components that we use for traumatic separation or traumatic grief. And I'm going to very briefly describe a quality improvement project that we applied for TFCBT related to children who have parental substance abuse. Just a quick review. The main substances in the US today in order of frequency are alcohol, heroin, fentanyl, methamphetamine, and cocaine. But because people talk a lot about the opioid pandemic or epidemic, opiates are any of a variety of sedative narcotics containing opium from the poppy plant. There are natural opiates, and then there are synthetics, which are sometimes called opioids, which are man-made. And those include heroin and fentanyl, which is 50 to 100 times more potent and very powerful than heroin, and then oxycodone and oxymorphine. when they were originally developed, they were marketed to physicians as not as addictive, much safer than the natural opiates, but that, of course, was not true. All of them are addictive, and some of them are much more dangerous because you don't necessarily know that that's what's in what you're using, and that makes the the overdose and potentially the fatal overdose risk much higher. So the scope of the problem is that we're in the midst of an opioid, particularly an opioid epidemic, on top of the other, substances of use. And thank you, Will, for highlighting, that alcohol is indeed still the most common substance use that's being abused. But there have been more than 70,000 fatal overdoses per year. And then, of course, many people are abusing opioids and not dying from them. And there has been a modest decrease in prescription opioids, but that's far outweighed by the increase of illicit opioid use and, in fact, fatal overdoses, which have risen in the last 5 years from about 5,700 to 36,000. And we just got data from the CDC in the last few weeks that has significantly increased during the COVID-19 pandemic related to the stress and isolation and so forth, from an average of 70,000 to more than 87,000 fatal overdoses. So the impact on youth, and we've heard from our last speakers about the traumatic impact on families, but specifically for children and adolescents, there is that danger and threat to their parents, but also the danger and risk to children. Because when the parent is in the midst of substance abuse, they're not available to take care of or protect their children. So it's not typically the parent who's abusing substances who is directly abusing the child, although they are sometimes neglecting the child, but it's often their partner who may abuse the child physically or sexually, or there are other people who are coming to sell or buy drugs or have access to the child because that substance abusing parent is not protecting the child. And we've seen all too many situations where that parent, in exchange for access to drugs, may allow somebody access to the child sexually or otherwise. And so we're having commercial sexual exploitation of children. And then the child may be removed from the parent's care. That might occur in very traumatic circumstances, such as a drug raid, or the parent disappears for days on end, and then the child is removed, and the child is worried about, is my parent safe? And that is even escalated during the COVID pandemic, where you don't know if the parent is safe from dying from COVID, and of course in ordinary circumstances, the parent might be, living on the street and exposed to all kinds of diseases anyway. In many circumstances, older children are parentified, taking care of their parents with substance abuse anyway, taking care of younger siblings. So these separations that are often, frequent, unpredictable, chaotic, children are worried about their parents. These separations are unpredictable, and in some circumstances, and I think, Tina, you may have described one of these circumstances, I don't want to presume, a parent or grandparent may die. In some of these cases, the child is the one who discovers the parent, and then that can be a traumatic death. Again, unpredictable. The child may try to resuscitate. The parent may be the one to call 911. There's often, self-blame. If only I had woken up earlier, if only I had stopped my parent from using, and so forth. So traumatic grief. And then there are corresponding risks for children developing post-traumatic stress, depression, anxiety, behavioral problems related to these traumas, their own substance abuse, and so forth. There are challenges to being able to provide evidence-based treatments or effective treatments because of unstable, chaotic placements, the child moving in and out of different placements, multiple system involvement, child protection, juvenile justice, and so forth. And then if the child is living with a parent with ongoing substance abuse, that may challenge our ability to provide consistent care. So I'm going to be talking about trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, or TFCBT, and how that can be helpful for the child and the parent who is recovering from substance abuse, or if that's not the case and the child is living with another caregiver, a foster parent, a kinship care, another family member. So TFCBT is an evidence-based trauma-focused treatment for children and ages 3 to 18 and non-offending caregivers. And I said, in most cases, even if a parent is has a substance abuse problem, they're rarely the parent who is the offending, caregiver, is rarely engaged in actively abusing or hurting the child. TFCBT is typically provided in 12 to 20 sessions for the child, and half of the session, if we can possibly engage a caregiver, is provided directly to that caregiver. We include several joint sessions with the child and the parent or caregiver. A child can have experienced any kind of trauma, including, parental substance abuse. And of course, it's trauma focused, so the child has significant trauma-related symptoms. Its components and phase-based treatment incorporates gradual exposure, by which we mean that we're in every session, every component, we're addressing the child's trauma-related difficulties, their trauma memories, their trauma cues, and we're including caregivers. TFCBT has a strong evidence base. It's been evaluated in 23 randomized controlled trials and many other effectiveness trials. TFCBT significantly improves PTSD symptoms and diagnosis, but also includes trauma-related depressive and anxiety symptoms. And many kids develop depression and anxiety, and they don't meet criteria for PTSD. Many children, as Tina was describing, develop anger and behavior problems or sexual behavior problems, negative beliefs, like I was saying a few minutes ago, it's my fault. If only I had done this X, Y, or Z, my parent wouldn't have died, or they wouldn't have these substance abuse problems. It's also significantly superior for improving parental support, the parent's own distress about what's happened to the child, and for helping parents develop effective parenting strategies. And it's also effective for youth who have complex PTSD, which is not included in DSM-5, as you all know, but is included in the 11th version of the International Classification for Diseases. And I won't have time to go into that in detail, but I will mention it in a few minutes. So here are the components and the phases of TFCBT. I will very briefly describe the different components. The components are summarized by the acronym PRACTICE, or it should be PRACTICE. So you see that in the left side of the slide. And we also encourage children and their caregivers to practice these skills in the stabilization phase throughout and between the sessions. So I'll be describing these. So the phases are really a skill building or stabilization phase, trauma narration and processing. I heard very briefly the speaker before the stories telling your story and how important that is, and I couldn't agree more. So that is trauma narration, telling the child, telling their story, their life story, and then integrating, putting it all together in the final phase. So in terms of the length of treatment, it's typically more like 12 to 16 sessions. The parenting piece goes on throughout treatment, and again, that gradual exposure of continuing to help children master, and their caregivers or parents master, those cues or reminders about their trauma experiences and memories throughout treatment. And then each phase lasts about the same amount of time. So if, for example, the whole treatment would last about 15 sessions, each of these phases would last about 5 sessions. So it's important to keep your eye on, if you're providing this treatment, on the pacing, on the proportionality, and not, avoid getting to the trauma narration, for example, when the child is going to be talking in more detail about their own trauma experiences, and keep moving forward. So I'm going to briefly describe a little bit about each of these components just to get an idea. So if we were, for example, talking about a child whose mother was using, say, heroin and fentanyl, and she experienced, of course, that trauma, but her mother's boyfriend was abusive to the mother. She was exposed to domestic violence, and while her mother was engaged in that substance abuse, that boyfriend also sexually abused her. We could imagine that that boyfriend became very verbally, angry, and would yell at the mother, and perhaps was verbally aggressive towards her as well before he would sexually abuse her, and would yell at her and call her names and so forth when she would try to protest. A trauma reminder, for example, for her, now that she's not living with that mother anymore and was in a foster home, a reminder might be if this foster parent might ask her to, clean up your room or do your homework, even if the foster mother wasn't yelling at her, or if she used a sharp tone of voice, that might serve as a reminder of when her mom's boyfriend would yell at her mother. And her response might be to feel afraid or feel scared. And she might respond, because this would trigger her sense of danger and fear. She might start yelling at the foster mother, or even might say, "I hate you," and might run away without any insight into what's really going on. So helping a child like this, and this is a very common scenario that we would see, and you could imagine that, from the kid's perspective, she's getting reminded and triggered, and feeling like, I'm getting yelled at all the time. I don't feel safe in this home. And so helping her to gain some insight and understanding of, why do I not feel safe here? And from the foster parent's perspective, she's seeing this kid as being, oppositional and angry all the time and not listening and having behavior problems. So we need to sort of bridge that gap and help the parent understand that this isn't a bad child. This is a child who's had a lot of bad and traumatic experiences, but also help this child understand that what's really going on is, she's safe, but she's developed a lot of trauma reactions to her trauma reminders. And she's not a bad kid. She's had a lot of bad experiences. She's, she did her best. She's doing her best to cope, but the responses she's developed may not be serving her best interest now, because running away and being out in the streets may actually not be the safest thing for her to do now. So helping her make connections between her trauma experiences in the past, and, naming them, using the direct words for those, connecting them to her parents, to her mother's substance abuse, and helping connect those to, how do you feel when your foster mother, tells you to pick up your broom? How does that feel? Well, she's yelling at me. She may not actually be yelling, but she's using a harsh voice, and that reminds you of when your mom's boyfriend used to yell, and that was scary. And she may not even say that, "I'm scared." She may think, "I'm mad." And then what's her response? It's to run away. So connecting trauma experiences to trauma reminders, to trauma reactions is really important, both for her and to her foster mother. And surprisingly, a lot of kids do not have information about parental substance abuse. And that education goes on not only here at the beginning, but throughout treatment. A lot of kids don't understand. They might think, "I'm afraid I'm going to turn out just like my mother." And they're afraid to ask about it because they have split loyalties. They love their parent. They're attached to them. They want to go back to them. Yet, they also have anger about, why did she love drugs more than me? Why are they continuing to make these choices? They don't understand that, although they have risks for, developing substance abuse, they also have choices. Their mother is perhaps making unhealthy choices and so forth, and they can make different choices. So providing that kind of education and continuing to make, provide that education, just like Tina was talking about, is really important, and to continue to do that as we go through this treatment. The parenting component, again, helping that foster parent to understand through a trauma lens how that child is acting, and providing some more information about how a parent can provide effective parenting to a child like this, while also validating that that is really, difficult. And just a shout out to all the parents, kinship care, foster parents, you're doing an amazing thing. You are really saving the world by the work that you do, and thank you so much for that. And just tweaking, the praise and the positive attention that you give, connecting the behavior problems to their trauma experiences. And then helping children and their parents to start using alternative strategies and skills, such as relaxation skills, for the physiologic impact. I think, Tina, you mentioned yoga and exercise and, progressive muscle relaxation, guided imagery and so forth, and monitoring, how am I doing with this? How is this working? Does this work in one situation but not another? Let's figure out something else. Journaling, distraction and so forth, dance, music, and then using those with whenever the trauma reminders occur. And I guarantee you, a child like this is not just hearing like loud voices at home with the foster parent. It happens in class. It happens out in the community, in the neighborhood with friends and so forth. So practicing different strategies, developing a toolkit for that, and continuing to practice and tweak it is really important. Affective modulation strategies, recognizing, at first I feel mad all the time, but recognizing behind that madness that, this child might say, initially I feel mad when my foster parent, tells me to pick up my room, she's yelling at me. Really behind that is fear. It makes me feel afraid. Is somebody going to hurt me here? And starting to, fine tune those, recognizing those different feelings. It's a lot easier to feel mad, feels less vulnerable than saying I feel scared or I'm lonely or, other kinds of feelings. And then developing, again, putting more tools in the toolkit about asking for support, calling up a friend, developing effective distraction activities and so forth. And then working with the foster parent and other adults, other supportive people to respond appropriately and supportively when the child tries to seek and tries to use these skills, and they're not going to use them perfectly. They may use them very imperfectly for a while. So, if a child, instead of running away, expresses that verbally by saying, I hate you, to this foster mother, I guarantee, most of us as parents are not going to say, oh, thank you so much for sharing. I'm so glad you're able to tell me that. So we have to practice in our half hour with the parents, practice and role play and fine tune. I remember, just a parent like this saying, this is like a child cleaning out an infection. It would be nice if when we cleaned out infections, it all came out rosy smelling and gently and smoothly. But, when you clean out the pus, often, it doesn't work out that way. Sometimes it spurts out and it's really smelly and ugly, right? And we need to be prepared for that. But it can't get, you can't clean out the infection if you don't get all that ugly pus out of there. And that foster mom came back to me and said, I had that image in my mind when she yelled at me and said, she actually said, I hate you. And instead of, saying you're disrespectful, what I said to her was, yeah, honey, I know it feels awful. Get it all out. And instead of, getting into a fight, she just broke down and cried, and I hugged her. And it worked out so much better because I was thinking of that pus coming out. And I realized that's what she's doing. She has to yell at me to get it all out. And we didn't get into a fight. So you see how we're bridging that gap, that, trying to help them be closer by helping to understand each other, and how important it is to work with the parent too. Cognitive processing skills is adding in the piece of what are the negative thoughts? And so many of these children have negative thoughts, as do their caregivers, and helping to develop the skill of exploring and just stopping and thinking about, what is my thought? Is it accurate? Is it helpful? Or developing even a more balanced thought, which is a skill that we have to practice. And in this component, we're just starting with everyday kinds of thoughts like nobody likes me, I don't have any friends, I'm stupid, I can't do this work in school. And then in the next component, we're going to be applying these skills when it comes to the trauma-related thoughts that are more malignant and more difficult to process, including children's thoughts about related to their parental substance abuse. I just want to mention, in collaboration with Carnegie Mellon's Entertainment Technology Center, we developed a free app for children probably about 7 to 14. It's the TFCBT Triangle of Life. You can download it from Google Plus or Apple Store. It has no specific reference to trauma. It's a lion in the African savannah. And that last picture from the art talk actually, came to mind because it's a lion in Africa interacting with different animals in the African jungle and sort of working with them to develop more helpful, accurate, or balanced thoughts. So I really refer you to that app if you're working with children, just generally to develop more accurate or helpful or balanced thinking, whether it's related to trauma, parental substance abuse, or just more generally. And so here's the cognitive triangle: thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, to try to connect those up. So that's the first phase of treatment, what we call the PRAC skills. And then the second phase is trauma narration and processing, where we help children speak the unspeakable, or what they believe is unspeakable, what they're afraid. If I tell you this, you will turn away from me, you won't believe it, I'll fall apart, my family will dissolve, or horrible things will happen, and make new meaning, make more helpful meaning, be able to move forward in a more healthy way. So we gradually help the child develop a detailed accounting of their personal trauma experiences. And often we know that trauma memories are stored in a chaotic, disorganized fashion, and they're often retrieved that way. But by sort of putting it together and having the child describe them in, over time, it gets more organized. We use the metaphor of cleaning out a closet, where the closet door flies open when you don't want to, and all that stuff that's in there sort of falls on your head when you don't want it to. And by cleaning out that closet, in a stepwise way, you can get rid of the things you don't need, which is your maladaptive, inaccurate beliefs about what happened, and you organize the things in there, which is your memories, and then you get to open the door when you choose to. You get to look at those memories when you want to, instead of the door flying open when you don't want to, or having intrusive thoughts. And this is really helpful for a lot of kids to figure out, why should I do this? Why should I go back and think about all those things I don't want to think about? As the child is developing the narration over 4, 5, or 6 sessions, we're sharing it with the parent or the caregiver in preparation for the conjoint sessions. But in between sessions, they're practicing those earlier PRAC skills. They're not reviewing the narrative over and over and over again. For children who have developed ongoing avoidance of innocuous situations like attending school, sleeping in their own room, using the bathroom, because they have over-associated that with traumatic experiences, we develop a fear hierarchy and help them gradually master returning to those situations so they don't have avoidance. Now, if those situations are still dangerous, we would focus on safety instead. So, as I said before, we're going to include several conjoint parent-child sessions where we would share the completed trauma narrative directly together with the parent and child. We may also develop a joint family safety plan here, discuss healthy sexuality, and do other things as individually indicated. This is also a good bridge to the additional traumatic grief or traumatic separation components if we need to include those. And the final component is enhancing safety. Trauma is a violation of safety and trust, so we need to develop an ongoing safety plan to assure that the child is safe. And this can be tailored to the individual child's situation. With children who have parental substance abuse, of course, we want to assure that there is a plan for the child to understand how to refuse drugs. You're not going to develop a substance abuse disorder if you never try drugs or alcohol, so that is an important skill to develop. And then just a few words about applications for complex trauma or complex PTSD. As I said, this is not in the current DSM-5, but in ICD-11, it is included. Complex PTSD is an additional diagnosis in addition to what is included as PTSD, which consists of intrusion, avoidance, and hyperarousal. Complex PTSD also, on top of those symptoms, includes dysregulation of affect, self-image, and interpersonal relationships. So, and that's probably most of the children we see who have parental substance abuse, as well as other children who have experienced early interpersonal trauma. And often, as I said, these children may be engaging in unsafe self-regulation strategies, like the girl I described who is running away when she has trauma reminders. So for children like that, we're going to move that enhancing safety component from the last component up to the very first component, and start addressing safety from the very beginning. Often those children additionally have severe affective or behavioral dysregulation. They've developed those strategies over a long period of time. They might not trust us. So the treatment overall may have to be a little longer. The prac skills, that first stabilization phase, might have to be proportionally a little longer. When I say a little longer, I'm talking about maybe 20 sessions overall for the whole treatment, or as long as 25 sessions, which is maybe 4 or 5 months, not a year. We also want to think about overarching trauma themes, like the people who should have protected me are the ones who hurt me, or everyone I ever loved have died or left me, and incorporate and weave those into understanding the trauma reminders and into the trauma narration. And often therapists, think that children who have complex PTSD, don't need to, or they may not want to at first include someone like this foster parent because their trust is impaired and it's difficult for them to trust this caregiver, or they have conflicts of, if I let this caregiver participate, that means I'm not being loyal to my birth parent who is, involved in substance abuse. But I think it's really even more important to include a caregiver to be able to learn to enhance safety, and that there is somebody I can trust who's an adult for these youth. So I'm going to turn now to the added components that we've developed for traumatic grief and traumatic separation. And the tasks of typical childhood grief have been described in detail by Worden and Wolfelt, and that includes accepting the permanence of death and dealing with the deep sadness that's associated with that. And of course, very young children struggle with that. Acknowledging what has been lost, and preserving positive memories and incorporating positive aspects of the person who has died into your own identity. Converting the relationship from one of interaction to one of memory, because the person who's died no longer continues to change and grow and develop, and especially with children who are continuing to grow and change at a rapid rate, it's important for children and teens to be able to commit to ongoing relationships with other people who are living, who are continuing to grow and change. And then to reestablish a healthy developmental trajectory. And that recognizing that there will be ongoing reminders. On the right hand of this slide, you see that the traumatic grief components we developed include components that address these tasks, that children who have traumatic grief sort of have gotten stuck on, they're not able to engage in those tasks because their trauma symptoms are sort of interfering with their ability to do that. But after they have completed the practice components, they hopefully have resolved those trauma symptoms, and then we want to just get them started on those typical tasks. So we will, engage in conversations about, what are your cultural and your family practices about grieving and bereavement, because grief especially is very, connected to cultural practices and family practices. What does your family and your religion or your culture believe happens after somebody dies? Do you believe in an afterlife or a heaven, or do you believe that you can communicate in some way with the person who dies? What are your faith traditions and so forth? Then naming the loss, understanding what have you lost? What are the positive things in terms of future things that you had hoped perhaps that you could do with the person, especially with a parent who has had parental substance abuse? There was always a hope in most children that, they would resolve that and I would get the parent back, and we can't make up for the time we lost, but hopefully we would be able to get back to engaging in positive activities. They would be here when I graduated, or would, they teach me to, do certain things. They'd be here when I, had a romantic partner, when I had kids or whatever. And now I can't do that anymore, or I can't even just do the regular things that we used to do when we had fun together. So I miss those things, but there are some things I don't miss. So having to address that, what do I miss? What don't I miss? I don't miss, having to worry about those things. I don't miss, waiting for that call. I don't miss all the times I was embarrassed, or I had to lie, or I had to worry about, is my parent okay? So those, positive and negative things. Once the child can acknowledge those, what I miss, what I don't miss, they're able to then go on to preserve those positive memories in a less ambivalent way. And then committing to new relationships. One of the things we do is a balloon exercise, like what can I hold on to? The things my parent taught me, my memories, their love for me. I might look like her, things she left me. But then there are things I can no longer hold on to, like the interactive activities, going on walks with her, doing things with her, baking cookies with her, those kinds of things. So then, exploring, are there other people that you could do one of those things with, or some of those things with, not to replace that person, but, what would your parent want for you? And that is a helpful exercise sometimes we will do, to imagine a letter that you could write to your parent who's deceased. What would you want to say to them? And that can sometimes resolve some of those ambivalent feelings. And then what would you imagine that your parent would write back to you? What do you think your parent would want for you? Would they want you to continue to be sad and, just think about, these ambivalent things for the rest of your life? What kind of life do you think they would want for you? Would they want you to, use drugs? Would they want the kind of life for you that they had, that would end early, that would be involved in substance abuse, and to be unhappy? And most kids, almost all the kids I've seen, have said they would want me to not use drugs. They would want me to, go to school. They would want me to have a happy life, and so forth. So having that come back to them in the voice, the imagined voice of their parent, is very powerful to them. And as part of that, that helps them commit to, I can do these things, some of these things anyway, that I can no longer do with my parent, with perhaps, another relative or the foster parent and so forth. So that's very helpful to them. And then treatment closure is recognizing that there will be dates and times, for example, the death date, the parent's birth date, maybe the child's birth date, Mother's Day, other, holidays that will be difficult, and making a plan for dealing with that, recognizing the plans may change. Now, traumatic separation is often more difficult even than traumatic grief, because traumatic grief, at least there's not a lot of ambivalence. The ambivalence may be the uncertainty of how the person died, but at least there's not ambivalence about whether they're coming back. They're dead and they can't return, at least in this life. Traumatic separation, there's a lot of struggle with the uncertainty. Will they get into recovery? Parents are often in and out of recovery. They get better for a little while and then they relapse. They promise they're going to visit. They visit for a few weekends and then they stop coming back. They get better, they get worse. They lie. They're sometimes reliable, sometimes not. And that naming the loss is really coping with the ambivalence, the uncertainty, the unpredictability is really, really painful and difficult for children. And then preserving positive connections is not only preserving positive connections with that parent, if it's possible to the degree that it is, but also trying to preserve positive connections to the child's extended family, to their culture, minimizing those cultural losses, the neighborhood, their faith community, their school, their friends, and all of those other things, with the caveat that sometimes it's a whole substance abuse culture. So having to balance that and figure out how can we maintain those positive connections with the parent and the family and the community without risking, to what extent are those connections with a substance abuse community, and that can be really challenging. And sometimes those connections also can be undermining to committing to new relationships, and there can be tension between the parent who is engaged in ongoing substance abuse and the current caregiver, whether that's a kinship care member, a grandparent, or other relative, or a foster parent. And that can make it very difficult for that current caregiver to effectively parent the child or even keep them safe. And so that is a really challenging situation. We really try to encourage that caregiver to not undermine, the love and connection and attachment with the biological parent and extended family, but it's really important to help the child also have a realistic view and an understanding about parental substance abuse and responsibility. And one of the things that we do to accomplish that is use an exercise we call, the backpack and suitcase. What is in the child's backpack? What's in the parent's suitcase? So helping the child understand what decisions, what responsibilities are yours, what are in your parents', suitcase, what decisions can you make, what can they make? So you're not responsible for keeping your parents safe. They have to keep themselves safe. They have the decisions about whether they use drugs, whether they are staying around people who use drugs or not, whether they go to meetings or not. You can't make those decisions. Only your parent can. You can make decisions about things that you do, whether you stay safe, whether you run away, whether you use drugs or alcohol, whether you do your homework, whether you follow the rules at your home, and so forth. But then, and then the foster parent or the kinship care parent works with us and the child to try to make those decisions and to communicate clearly and provide transparent information about how decisions are being made, and make it in collaboration with the child, depending on the child's developmental level, on, what is safe, how are we going to help you stay safe, and, how can we make good decisions about, for example, visits, and what are the decisions your mother is making about her safety, and how does that impact your safety, and so forth. So we really want to preserve those positive connections while keeping that child safe. addressing role changes is really important because often, as we talked about, these kids are parentified. They have been in the position prior to, the separation or when they've been going back and forth of taking care of the parent, of making sure the parent was safe, of making sure their siblings were taken care of. And now we want to, that has changed often. And we're trying to assure that they're not parentified, that they're not taking on a parent role. But that can be really uncomfortable. And the child, doesn't want to give up those roles and doesn't even know who they are if they're not taking on those responsibilities. And they bridle against it. So helping the child, again, understand what is my responsibility, what is the parent's responsibility, what's the foster parent's responsibility, and so forth. So it can be very challenging to do that. And again, treatment closure issues. And when we're terminating treatment, it's really helpful to give children their voice in how do I want to say goodbye. And that, these kids have often had unplanned losses, and whether it's because of these chaotic changes in their living circumstances, traumatic deaths, and so forth. So when we're ending treatment, having them have a say in how that goes is really important. So I'm going to just briefly talk about this quality improvement study. This was a 2-year project at our small center, and it ended in February 2020, so right before the start of the pandemic. At that point, we were not permitted to use telehealth for children and adolescents, and I will briefly address that as well. So we were evaluating these TFCBT applications using complex trauma applications, traumatic separation, traumatic grief applications for children who had parental substance abuse. And then we were using, whatever applications were appropriate for children who did not have parental substance abuse. And we have many different TFCBT applications. Whatever was appropriate for youth who did not have parental substance abuse, but had a variety of other ongoing issues. So this was for 532 consecutively evaluated youth between 7 and 17 years old. A little more than a third of them reported parental substance abuse via our standard clinical assessment. Their mean age was almost 12 years old. About 60% were female, about 2/3 were white. And the 2 outcomes we were looking at, again, this was just usual care, nothing, it wasn't a funded treatment study. It was just, what are we doing in our clinic? We just looked at treatment retention through the end of treatment and improvement in PTSD symptoms using the Child PTSD Symptom Scale for DSM-5. 22 had scores that did not indicate significant PTSD. 4, were developmentally delayed or used a different scale. 21 were referred for non-trauma focused treatment. 16 received TFCBT but did not identify that the parental substance abuse was relevant. So of the remaining 119, 69 who had parental substance abuse, 69 completed TFCBT and 50 dropped out. So that's a 58% completion rate, which is not very good. So looking at the retention rate, 58% of those who had parental substance abuse completed versus over 79% of the rest of the group. And the chi-square for that, the statistical analysis showed that that was statistically significant. At the 0.05 level. So there were significantly more dropouts among the group of children who had parental substance abuse. The common reasons for dropping out included frequent moves back and forth between different placements, often returning to the parent who had substance use, and then often they were living in chaotic circumstances. The caregiver had many other children. They were overwhelmed. They were living with poverty. They didn't have transportation, although we tried to help them with that. So those were the typical reasons they did not stay in treatment. In terms of improvement in PTSD symptoms, the outcomes were virtually identical in both groups, the group with parental substance abuse and children without parental substance abuse, they improved from from fairly severe to mild in both groups. They were almost the identical scores. So the clinical significance of these findings is that we have to do better to try to engage or address the issue of dropouts among the children who have parental substance abuse. The retention rate is really an issue. But on the positive side, these TFCBT applications for complex trauma, traumatic grief, and traumatic separation can effectively address trauma symptoms for youth who have parental substance abuse if we can address the issues of access. So the impact of telehealth in the last year or so, I'm sorry, I'm hearing some echo, seemed to be cutting the no-show rate, for both our usual
Dr.
clinic.
Cohen?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. We're actually about 6 minutes over, and we have another session coming up, and people haven't had a break this entire morning.
Okay.
So just out of respect, if you could just tie up within like the next minute.
Yes, I will.
Thank you.
Yes, so telehealth has addressed that, gotten down the retention rate up to 20% among youth with parental substance abuse. I'm just, you can please share these slides with resources. There are several resources, including books for children, our web-based training, our national therapist certification site. And I just want to end, here are some references. I just want to end with Maya Angelou, where we started, who says the world has changed one child at a time. And I want to thank you for everything you do for children who are impacted by parental substance abuse and by trauma. So thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate being included in your Cultural Diversity Day. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cohen. I just want to remind everyone we'll take a brief break, and then we're going to be switching over to a different link for the grand rounds. So we'll see you all over there.